They say history is written by the victors, but they never mention how weird the victors actually were. The U.S. military has launched psychic spies, trained attack dolphins, and once tried to fight war with weather and bees. This isn't conspiracy, it's declassified. Strap in for 101 of the most ridiculous, absurd, and absolutely real moments in U.S. military history, where genius meets madness and somehow gets a budget. This isn't just war. It's bureaucracy with a flamethrower. The U.S. Navy once considered using hot air balloons as aircraft carriers in the 1930s. In the 1930s, someone in the Navy must have stared long enough at a dirigible and thought, what if this could launch fighter planes? And thus, the great floating aircraft carrier fantasy was born. These weren't just ideas scribbled on a napkin during lunch breaks. They actually built two massive airships, the USS Akron and USS Macon, both designed to carry and deploy tiny fighter planes mid-air like mechanical barn swallows. Inside their giant helium bellies, they had hangars, trapeze-like launch mechanisms, and a glorious delusion that these airborne beasts could patrol the skies above oceans forever, immune to submarine attacks and grounded by nothing but hubris. Spoiler, both crashed. One in a storm, the other because, surprise, it was a giant balloon filled with flammable gas trying to fight gravity and logic. The fact that these flying war zeppelins were considered viable military hardware says less about the Navy's engineering and more about the era's optimism, or perhaps its deep-rooted denial of physics. But to their credit, they dreamed big, literally 785 feet long big. And if you thought airborne blimps with onboard fighter hangars were absurd, wait until you hear about pigeons with cameras strapped to their necks. During World War II, the U.S. military trained pigeons to carry cameras for aerial reconnaissance. When you imagine elite aerial surveillance units, your brain doesn't naturally go to a sky full of highly motivated pigeons. But in World War II, the U.S. military had a very serious taxpayer-funded program involving strapping tiny cameras onto birds and launching them into the war-torn skies of Europe. You see, pigeons are naturally great at flying home. Add a camera timer and voila, you have yourself a feathery reconnaissance drone with wings. The plan was almost elegant. Release the pigeons behind enemy lines, let them fly back to base while snapping a few photos along the way, and then develop the footage. No parachutes, no payloads, no radios. Just a bird with a GoPro before GoPros were a thing. Of course, there were issues. Birds don't always follow orders. Sometimes they flew into the wrong war. Sometimes they just didn't come back. And sometimes they returned with pictures of trees, roofs, or their own tail feathers. But to the military's credit, they kept trying. Because when you're fighting a global war, even a blurry snapshot of a German airfield from a bird's eye view might be worth more than gold, or at least more than another human soul in a reconnaissance plane. Which brings us to a phrase that perfectly captures military optimism in the face of madness: Snafu. The term snafu originated with the U.S. Army during World War II. There's a certain poetry in the fact that one of the most enduring linguistic gifts of the U.S. military is an acronym that even sanitized translates to "everything is broken and this is fine." Snafu, situation normal, all F*** it up, was coined by World War II soldiers who had the uncomfortable habit of telling the truth. It wasn't official, but it spread through units faster than rations and rashes, because everyone, from generals to grunts, knew the real logistics of war rarely resembled the neat little arrows drawn on command center maps. Snafu was a morale booster cloaked in gallows humor, a linguistic middle finger to bureaucracy, and a badge of ironic honor for soldiers trying to navigate a world of contradictory orders, missing supplies, and friendly fire labeled unfortunate coincidences. It was catharsis in acronym form. Later came FUBAR, TARFU, and the military's rich tradition of turning frustration into a new dialect. But Snafu was the OG, America's crowning achievement in making catastrophe sound routine. And if you think a cynical nickname is wild, wait until you learn that America's most iconic war poster was inspired by a guy who packed beef. The famous Uncle Sam image was based on a real person, Samuel Wilson, a meat packer who supplied barrels of beef to the U.S. Army during the War of 1812. The most iconic face of American war propaganda, stern, pointy-bearded, and pointing directly into your soul, was inspired not by a general, president, or revolutionary firebrand, but by a guy who packed salted meat into barrels. Samuel Wilson, a New York meat supplier during the War of 1812, stamped his provisions with Envoy US for United States. But soldiers, being naturally bored and prone to myth-making, decided it stood for Uncle Sam, a nickname for Wilson that quickly caught on. It was funny. It stuck. And then it metastasized into national symbolism. Over time, the fictional Uncle Sam figure evolved from a friendly folk caricature into a recruitment icon with an accusatory finger and no patience for your personal plans. Somewhere between meat barrels and military drafts, a mythic uncle emerged. One who wouldn't buy you Christmas gifts but would definitely send you to die in Europe. This is the American way. Take a practical solution to a food logistics issue, wrap it in myth, slap it on a poster, and aim it squarely at 18-year-olds. It's marketing by way of mythology. And if you think the military's connection to food logistics ends with meat barrels, wait until you hear about their first submarine. Spoiler, it drowned. The first U.S. military submarine, the USS Alligator, sank during a storm in 1863 while being towed. The USS Alligator was America's first attempt at an underwater war machine. It was sleek, greenish, and vaguely reptilian, hence the name, and entirely ahead of its time in the worst way possible. Built during the Civil War, it featured paddles for propulsion, a primitive airlock system for divers, and a design that screamed experimental death trap. Engineers were optimistic. Sailors were less enthusiastic. The Alligator never actually saw combat. Instead, it spent most of its short life being towed around like an unwanted birthday present no one knew what to do with. In 1863, while en route to a mission that probably would have gone poorly anyway, a storm rolled in. The crew of the towing vessel decided to cut it loose. The Alligator went down, taking its mysterious innards and glorious potential with it to the ocean floor. No one died, but no one really won either. It was a bizarre, ironic chapter in naval history. The submarine that never submerged for battle. The innovation that drowned before its debut. Yet the military never stopped dreaming about using deception in new theatrical ways. And that's exactly how they ended up creating an entire army of inflatable tanks. The U.S. military once employed a unit of ghost army artists who used inflatable tanks and fake radio traffic to deceive the Germans in World War II. Imagine if your top-secret military unit looked more like an avant-garde theater troupe than a platoon. That was the Ghost Army. A strange, delightful, and deadly serious outfit of artists, sound engineers, and radio operators tasked with convincing the Nazis that invisible armies were lurking everywhere. Their weapons, inflatable tanks, loudspeakers blasting fake motor convoys, Morse code messages typed into the void, and the sheer confidence to act like a real battalion. Deployed across Europe during World War II, the Ghost Army was a masterclass in deception. They'd roll into towns, blow up rubber artillery, sew patches for imaginary divisions, and pipe the sounds of armored columns through forests. Whole German units were rerouted or stalled by nothing but clever staging. Think Ocean's 11, but with war crimes and camouflage. The best part? Most of them were artists from New York. Guys who once painted in Greenwich Village were now faking entire war fronts. No bullets, just bravado, illusion, and inflatable everything. The Ghost Army proved that warfare isn't always about firepower. It's about fooling someone into shooting in the wrong direction. And if inflatable tanks seem absurd, just wait until the story of the Army's first official cook. A woman who escaped captivity and came back swinging. The U.S. Army's first official cook was a woman named Hannah Duston, who escaped Native American captivity in 1697. Long before MREs, mess halls, and culinary specialists, the U.S. Army's first known cook was not a trained chef, nor a soldier. She was a Puritan woman named Hannah Duston, and she earned her unofficial military credentials not through service, but vengeance. In 1697, during King William's War, Duston was captured during a brutal Native American raid on her New Hampshire village, taken deep into the wilderness with her newborn child, who was killed during the abduction. Hannah's future seemed sealed. It wasn't. One night, alongside 2 other captives, she murdered her captors, men, women, and children, using tomahawks while they slept. Then she scalped them, all 10. She brought the scalps back as proof. Colonial authorities paid her a bounty, and somehow, this blood-soaked tale of survival, rage, and maternal retribution got folded into early American military lore. Why? Because she cooked for soldiers later, and because America has a strange habit of glorifying brutality when it comes wrapped in frontier myth. Her story doesn't fit neatly into modern categories. She's part hero, part horror show, part propaganda, a woman who was canonized for her violence, and then put in the kitchen. In some warped cosmic joke, Hannah Duston became both the prototype for the army cook and an early symbol of colonial toughness. War has always loved paradoxes, especially when they come wielding kitchen knives. And if you think a scalp-collecting Puritan-turned-cook is odd, just wait for the next one. The 4-legged war hero who outranked most privates. The highest-ranking animal in U.S. military history was Sergeant Stubby, a Wetterwan dog who was promoted for catching a German spy. Sergeant Stubby was a Boston Terrier mix. He had no pedigree, no papers, and no idea what Europe was. But when Wetterwan rolled around, Stubby stowed away with his human, Private Robert Conroy, on a ship bound for France. What began as a mascot quickly escalated into something much stranger. A combat veteran with over 17 battles under his collar, multiple injuries, and, most importantly, a documented case of capturing a German spy by literally biting him in the butt. Stubby could warn of gas attacks, locate wounded soldiers, and, most importantly, boost morale. The men loved him. Officers respected him. Eventually, someone pinned a uniform on him and promoted him to sergeant, technically giving him higher rank than some of the actual humans around him. The Army being the Army, no one questioned it. After the war, Stubby toured the country like a furry war celebrity, met presidents, and got a medal or 2. No one knows if he understood any of it. What's certain is that he embodied something oddly American. The lovable underdog who stumbled into greatness and then refused to leave. But dogs aren't the weirdest creatures the Army's experimented with. For that, you'd have to look at the Camel Corps. The U.S. Army once tried using camels for transportation in the American Southwest in the 1850s. In the 1850s, the U.S. Army was trying to figure out how to traverse the brutally dry, mountainous, sun-bleached hellscape that is the American Southwest. Horses died, wagons broke, mules gave up. So someone in Washington got the brilliant idea, what about camels? After all, they thrive in deserts, carry heavy loads, and spit at things they don't like. They were perfect. On paper. So in 1856, the Army imported a batch of camels from the Middle East, along with a few foreign camel handlers who probably wondered what sins they'd committed to end up in Texas. For a time, it kind of worked. Camels hauled gear. They moved through terrain that stopped wagons cold. But there was a problem. They terrified horses. They smelled bad. Soldiers hated them. They couldn't be controlled the same way, and the Army, like most institutions, was allergic to change. Then the Civil War happened. Budgets were cut. The camel program was abandoned. Some were sold, some escaped, and some were last seen wandering the deserts like confused ghosts of military misadventure. A few sightings persisted into the 20th century, like some cryptid with a saddle. So yes, the U.S. once field-tested camel cavalry. But if you think that's weird, remember, the very first casualty of the American Revolution was a black man, and his name wasn't Paul Revier. The first American to be killed in the American Revolution was Crispus Attucks, a free black man during the Boston Massacre. Crispus Attucks didn't live to see the American Revolution, but he died making sure it happened. On March 5, 1770, 5 years before independence was even a whisper on parchment. British soldiers opened fire on a crowd of colonists in Boston. Among them was Attucks, a dock worker of African and Native American descent. He wasn't just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was the front line, the first body to hit the cobblestone. History remembers it as the Boston Massacre, a blood-soaked precursor to revolution, immortalized in angry pamphlets and Paul Revier's etchings. But what most of those engravings leave out, deliberately, is that the first man killed for what would become the United States was black. It's not the narrative colonial elites were eager to carve into their marble monuments. Attucks became both a martyr and an inconvenient truth. A man of color standing at the literal beginning of a nation that would spend the next 2 centuries pretending people like him weren't there from the start. He was buried with honors, then mostly edited out of the textbooks for a solid 100 years. Revolutionary blood didn't care about race, but the post-revolutionary narrative certainly did. And that contradiction would echo across every American war that followed, including one where German soldiers coined a nickname that Marines still wear with pride. The U.S. Marine Corps has a tradition of Teufelhunden, devil dogs, a nickname given to them by German soldiers in World War I. You know you've made an impression on your enemy when they start calling you monsters. According to Marine Corps lore, during the savage trench fighting of World War I, German soldiers began referring to the U.S. Marines as Teufelhunden, devil dogs. The nickname stuck, partially because it sounded terrifying, partially because Marines liked the ring of it. After all, who wouldn't want to be known as a hellhound in olive drab? The legend traces back to the Battle of Belleau Wood in 1918, a bloodbath of mud, mustard gas, and bayonets. The Marines were relentless, charging through enemy fire with the tenacity of, well, rabid dogs. The Germans supposedly whispered the term in fear. Whether or not they actually did is beside the point now. The Corps embraced it like a tattoo, etched deep into its tradition, its recruiting posters, and eventually into the psyche of every fresh recruit. Devil dogs became a brand, a myth, a growling badge of honor. And like all great myths, it was too good to fact-check. It didn't matter if the Germans actually said it. The Marines believed it. And that's how history works, when it's wrapped in bravado and bullets. But speaking of relics that refuse to die, meet the USS Constitution. Still afloat, still commissioned, and older than Napoleon's ghost. The U.S. Navy's oldest active commissioned ship is the USS Constitution. Launched in 1797, she was born when George Washington was still breathing and has outlived every war she was built for. The USS Constitution, affectionately known as Old Ironsides, isn't just a ship. She's a floating anachronism. Launched in 1797, this wooden-hulled frigate has been commissioned longer than most countries have existed. She's technically still part of the U.S. Navy and still has an official crew. Yes, they wear 18th century uniforms. No, she doesn't have Wi-Fi. During the War of 1812, British cannonballs bounced off her thick oak hull like insults off a grizzled sailor, earning her that legendary nickname. The Constitution didn't just survive, she won. Ship after ship, she embarrassed the world's most dominant navy and became the maritime embodiment of "don't mess with us." Over the centuries, she's dodged decommissioning, dismantling, and even being used for scrap, saved time and again by public outcry and romantic nationalism. Today, she floats in Boston Harbor, more museum than menace, but still technically ready for action. The irony? In an age of nuclear subs and drone swarms, the Navy still honors a wooden warship powered by wind. But then again, this is the same military that once planned to bomb cities using bats. The U.S. Army developed a bat bomb project in World War I, intending to drop bombs with bats carrying incendiary devices. In the long and deeply unhinged history of American war experiments, the bat bomb holds a special smoky little corner. It was the brainchild of a dentist. Yes, a dentist, who suggested, with complete sincerity, that the best way to destroy Japanese cities was to strap tiny incendiary bombs to bats, let them loose over enemy territory, and let nature handle the rest. The bats would roost in the wooden eaves of buildings, and the delayed fuses would do the rest. The plan was equal parts horrifying and weirdly plausible, which is probably why the military took it seriously. The project was dubbed Project X-Ray, and to the astonishment of absolutely no one, it got out of hand immediately. Thousands of bats were collected and equipped with napalm. One test went spectacularly wrong when a group of the bats, prepped for a trial run, escaped and accidentally set fire to the test facility itself. It's a little poetic. The military tried to create a flying incendiary swarm, and the first thing it torched was its own infrastructure. Despite its initial promise and the Army's eternal optimism, the project was shelved. Not because it didn't work, but because the atomic bomb arrived and made flaming bats seem a bit too subtle. The bat bomb is now a cautionary tale in the annals of wartime overthinking. When the military gets creative, someone always ends up running from flaming mammals. But bat bombs weren't the only air-based idea floating around at the time. Some geniuses were already thinking bigger, much bigger, like inflatable radar dome on a blimp bigger. The U.S. military briefly considered using giant inflatable radar domes towed by blimps in the 1950s. Let's take a moment to appreciate just how obsessed mid-century military planners were with blimps. Maybe it was the post-war optimism. Maybe it was the helium fumes. Either way, the 1950s saw some incredibly earnest proposals involving giant floating platforms of doom. Among them, inflatable radar domes suspended by blimps, drifting silently over oceans and borders, scanning the skies for Soviet threats like some low-budget Bond villain contraption. These floating beacons of vigilance would theoretically hover in place, detect incoming bombers, and coordinate defenses. In reality, you had a huge, vulnerable, gas-filled party balloon with a radar dish glued to it, floating in winds that didn't particularly care about strategic doctrine. And you had ground crews who, presumably, spent a lot of time staring at ropes and praying for low-pressure systems. The logistics were a nightmare. The practicality was laughable. And the optics, giant inflatable eyeballs in the sky, didn't exactly scream military dominance. Eventually, satellite technology and radar stations rendered the dream obsolete. But for a brief, glorious moment, American defense involved a lot of hot air. Literally. Still, this wasn't the first time a man with a strange idea and a horse ended up in military command. Take Paul Revier, for example, not just a midnight rider, but also an underwhelming colonel. Paul Revier, famous for his ride, also served in the Continental Army as a colonel. We all know the legend. Paul Revier, galloping through the night, lanterns in church towers, shouting about British troops to sleepy colonists who presumably thanked him and went back to bed. But fewer people know what happened after the famous ride, when Revier tried to become a full-time military man, and it didn't go quite as well. After the revolution got rolling, Revier was made a lieutenant colonel of artillery in the Massachusetts militia. Not bad for a silversmith. But it turns out riding a horse quickly at midnight doesn't necessarily translate into battlefield leadership. During the ill-fated Penobscot expedition of 1779, Revier was accused of insubordination, disobeying orders, and generally being more trouble than he was worth. He was arrested and faced a court-martial, though he was eventually acquitted. Still, the bloom was off the historical rose. The man remembered for saving the revolution very nearly botched one of its biggest naval embarrassments. Revier faded from military history not with a bang, but with a bureaucratic shuffle. But don't worry, America never stays out of the skies for long. Not when flying saucers are involved. And yes, the Air Force had thoughts about those too. The U.S. Air Force once had a program to study UFOs called Project Blue Book. Before aliens were a meme and conspiracy theorists had internet forums, they had Project Blue Book. Running from 1952 to 1969, this was the U.S. Air Force's official, taxpayer-funded attempt to understand, or at least catalog, the increasingly frequent reports of unidentified flying objects. To be clear, This wasn't a fringe operation in a basement with a guy named Carl wearing a tinfoil hat. This was institutional. Military officers, analysts, file cabinets filled with blurry photos and the vague smell of existential dread. Blue Book started with a genuine Cold War concern. Are these flying things Soviet tech? But as sightings kept pouring in, thousands of them, ranging from drunk farmers to credible pilots, the questions got weirder. Could they be American tech? Optical illusions? Atmospheric phenomena? Space visitors? The conclusions were murky. Of the 12,000+ cases investigated, the vast majority were chalked up to weather balloons, planets, or pilot error. But about 700 stayed stubbornly unexplained. And while the official stance was, "Nothing to see here, folks," the sheer volume of unanswered incidents left a tantalizing silence. When Blue Book was finally shut down in 1969, the Air Force declared UFOs no longer a threat to national security, without ever actually explaining what they were. The files were declassified. The myths began to mutate. And just like that, the U.S. military handed pop culture the seeds of Area 51, alien autopsies, and every grainy saucer photo ever uploaded to YouTube. Still, the Air Force never really stopped trying to use nature in weird ways, which leads us directly to the next aquatic espionage project. Dolphins who mine the seas. The U.S. Army once tried to use specially trained dolphins to detect underwater mines. If the military can strap cameras to pigeons and bombs to bats, then training dolphins to find underwater mines starts to sound, dare we say, reasonable. These animals are smart, fast, echolocating torpedoes with a sense of play and a built-in radar system. So in the 1960s, the U.S. military looked at Flipper and saw a weapons detection system. The dolphins were trained to swim into hostile waters and identify floating or buried explosives. With sonar-like abilities, they could outmatch human divers in speed and precision. Some were even trained to tag mines with marker buoys or nudge them with devices. Others were reportedly taught to neutralize enemy swimmers. Interpret that however you'd like. Of course, this program wasn't without complications. Dolphins are individuals. Some refused to cooperate. Some wandered off. Others became depressed or aggressive. Turns out military service is rough, even for sea creatures. But the idea persisted. For decades, the Navy quietly maintained a small army of marine mammals, just in case. The whole concept blurs the line between genius and Bond villain. Weaponized nature, animal operatives, and in true American fashion, the plan almost worked. Almost. Speaking of things that might have almost made sense, let's talk about how an idiom you've heard your entire life might have started with machine gun belts and bomber crews. The phrase, "the whole 9 yards," is rumored to have originated from the length of machine gun belts on World War II bombers. You've said it, you've heard it. Give 'em the whole 9 yards. And like most colloquial phrases, you probably never wondered where it came from. But according to one popular military myth, it traces back to World War II bomber crews and the length of the ammunition belts for their .50 caliber machine guns. Each belt, the story goes, measured exactly 9 yards. So when a gunner unloaded everything he had, every round, no holding back, he was said to have given the enemy the whole 9 yards. It's a beautiful origin story, gritty, cinematic, and tied to the physical realities of combat. One man, one belt of ammo, one moment of pure, unfiltered American overkill. There's just one catch. It might not be true. Linguists have poked holes in the timeline. Earlier uses of the phrase show up in different contexts, and no one's ever found a technical manual confirming the belts were, in fact, precisely 9 yards long. But in the world of military lore, truth is optional. What matters is believability, and this one fits like a bullet in a chamber. And speaking of long traditions, the next one predates every flying branch. It's the sea service that never sleeps. The U.S. Coast Guard is the nation's oldest continuous seagoing service. Everyone thinks of the Navy as America's oldest maritime force, and technically it is, if you're only counting combat fleets. But when it comes to constant, uninterrupted service on the water, It's the Coast Guard that holds the crown. Established in 1790 as the Revenue Cutter Service, its original job was less heroic sea rescues and more, please stop smuggling tea, which makes sense. The United States, fresh off a revolution, was broke. Smugglers were bleeding the treasury dry, and someone had to chase them down. And so the Coast Guard was born, not with fanfare or warships, but with a few fast schooners and the directive to collect customs duties. Over time, the role expanded. Search and rescue, law enforcement, icebreaking, war support, drug interdiction, and occasionally catching people doing very stupid things in very small boats during very large storms. What makes the Coast Guard unique is its dual identity. It's a military service, yes, but also a federal law enforcement agency. That means it can do things other branches can't, like board ships in peacetime, arrest people, and even get deployed alongside the Navy during wartime. For over 2 centuries, through peace, war, prohibition, hurricanes, and whatever you'd call spring break in Miami, the Coast Guard has stayed afloat, figuratively and literally. It is the maritime equivalent of duct tape, humble, reliable, and criminally underappreciated. And yet, as practical as the Coast Guard is, the U.S. military has never been shy about embracing sheer absurdity, which is how we got a plan to build an aircraft carrier out of an iceberg. The U.S. military once had a plan to build an iceberg aircraft carrier during Swoo. It sounds like something dreamed up by a drunk engineer during a snowstorm, but this was a real proposal. Build a floating aircraft carrier out of ice. During World War II, with German U-boats making life hell in the Atlantic, the British, yes, this idea actually started with them, proposed creating massive, unsinkable platforms from frozen water to serve as mid-ocean bases for aircraft. The Americans joined in, intrigued by the concept. The key material? A strange composite called pykrete, a mix of ice and wood pulp that was stronger, slower to melt, and bullet-resistant. Yes, they shot it to test it. Yes, it held up. Plans were drawn. Models were built. There was even a prototype tested in a Canadian lake. But as the war progressed, conventional carriers got better, and the urgency behind the project melted, literally and figurative. The dream of a 2-million-ton frozen leviathan bristling with planes faded into the slush pile of military history. Still, the idea of weaponizing nature persisted, which brings us to the origins of an American symbol you probably never questioned, the flag. Spoiler, it wasn't Betsy Ross with a needle and a smile. The first American flag was designed by Francis Hopkinson, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Betsy Ross gets all the press, but the first person to actually submit a bill to Congress for designing the American flag was Francis Hopkinson, a lawyer, writer, amateur poet, and signer of the Declaration of Independence. A true Renaissance man in powdered wig form. Hopkinson was part of the Continental Congress and had a hand in designing everything from the Great Seal to early currency. But somewhere along the line, he sketched out a flag, 13 stars, 13 stripes, a layout meant to symbolize unity without hierarchy. No king, no empire, just a constellation of equals. He even billed Congress for his work. His invoice, a quarter cask of wine. Congress, true to form, never paid him. While there's still debate over the exact look of the first flag, star circles, star rows, star chaos, Hopkinson's contribution is the one with actual paperwork. He wrote to Congress, he gave them options, he asked for acknowledgement, he got ghosted. Still, his stars and stripes became the bones of every American flag since. A simple design that turned into a complex identity. One stitched into every uniform, planted in every battlefield, and eventually attached to the leg of a heroic pigeon. The U.S. Army once had a pigeon named G.I. Joe who saved over 1,000 British troops in World War II by delivering a message. He weighed a few ounces, didn't speak a word, and wore no uniform. But G.I. Joe did something in World War II that would make even the most hardened sergeant blink. He saved over 1,000 British soldiers from being bombed by their own allies. And he did it with a message strapped to his leg. The year was 1943. The location, an Italian village called Calvi Vecchia. British forces had just captured it from the Germans faster than expected. The problem? An American airstrike had already been scheduled to obliterate the town under the assumption it was still in enemy hands. Radios were down. Runners were too slow. Chaos was imminent. Enter G.I. Joe, a homing pigeon trained by the U.S. Army Signal Corps. Released into the sky with a desperate plea tied to his leg, he flew 20 miles in just over 20 minutes, cutting through gunfire, smoke, and the general entropy of war. His message arrived at the airbase mere minutes before the bombers were scheduled to take off. The strike was called off. The village and its new Allied occupants were spared. For his efforts, G.I. Joe received medals, fame, and a retirement far more comfortable than most veterans. He even got a spot in the royal loft of the United Kingdom. A pigeon, with more confirmed saves than most humans. And if that sounds impressive, just wait until you meet the Cold War cats wired for espionage. The U.S. military once trained cats to be spies, attaching microphones to them in the 1960s. Somewhere in the deep recesses of 1960s paranoia, amid Cuban crises and Khrushchev's shoes, someone in U.S. intelligence stared at a purring house cat and thought, we could wiretap the Soviets with this. Thus began one of the strangest and most ill-fated operations in espionage history. Acoustic Kitty. The plan was delightfully insane. Cats, being stealthy, agile, and already suspicious of humans, would be surgically implanted with microphones and transmitters. The idea was to release these feline spies near Soviet embassies, where they would casually stroll into conversations and broadcast them back to American agents. In reality, cats don't care about geopolitics, or training, or walking in straight lines. In one early test, the cat wandered into traffic and was immediately hit by a taxi. Other attempts ended with cats refusing to go where they were told. The project was eventually deemed a complete failure, at the cost of millions of dollars and untold damage to feline dignity. Acoustic Kitty never got its Cold War thriller moment. But it did prove a timeless truth. No amount of funding can make a cat do what you want. Still, if you're looking for short-lived military endeavors, look no further than the U.S. invasion of Grenada. The shortest war in U.S. history was against Grenada in 1983, lasting only a few days. Grenada, 1983. A tiny Caribbean island nation with a population smaller than most U.S. cities suddenly found itself the focus of a full-scale American invasion. Why? Depending on whom you ask. Marxist influence, regional instability, protection of American medical students, or simply Reagan flexing during a slow news cycle. The operation was dubbed Urgent Fury, a name that sounds like it was pulled from a failed Schwarzenegger script, and it involved nearly 7,000 U.S. troops, several Navy ships, and a lot of confusion. The intelligence was murky. The maps were outdated. Communications were a mess. But within 3 days, the invasion was over. The government was replaced, and America had a brand new talking point about stopping communism in the tropics. Military critics were baffled. Allies were annoyed. Even Margaret Thatcher scolded Reagan. But to the American public, it was a tidy little war with a clear start, a fast win, and a beachy backdrop. It was, by military standards, absurdly short. But it still cost lives, equipment, and international goodwill. A postcard-sized war with real-world consequences. And as quick as it ended, it wasn't the last time the U.S. deployed animals into active service. Just ask the Navy's underwater retrievers. The U.S. Navy once had a program to use sea lions to recover underwater objects. In the grand American tradition of weaponizing animals and then asking them to clean up after us, the Navy decided sea lions would make excellent salvage divers. Specifically, they were trained to locate and recover lost or deliberately placed objects underwater. Mines, test equipment, maybe the occasional dropped wrench from an unlucky sailor. Sea lions, it turns out, are agile, quick, and can dive far deeper and longer than humans with zero regard for decompression sickness or union pay scales. The program came out of the Cold War era, when underwater warfare became a serious frontier. With the threat of submarines, mines, and lost technology scattered across the ocean floor, the military turned to nature's slickest little swimmers. The sea lions were trained using clickers and fish incentives to locate targets, clamp recovery devices on them, and return for their reward. Basically like very wet, military-grade retrievers. They worked from special platforms, were helicopter deployable, and could even be outfitted with cameras and sonar. While the project was never as high profile as the Dolphin mine hunters, sea lions proved to be more reliable than many remote-controlled submersibles of the era. And, perhaps most importantly, they didn't require recharging. Though eventually replaced by better tech and less fish-intensive solutions, the Sea Lion unit was another entry in the long list of "this really shouldn't have worked, but somehow it did" ideas. It wasn't glamorous, but it was effective, and weird enough to make you rethink every visit to an aquarium. Of course, not every animal in World War II was there to do jobs. Some just ended up flying through it all, like the B-17 bomber named the Swoo. The U.S. Army Air Forces flew a bomber named the Swoo, which was the only B-17 to fly from the beginning to the end of World War II. Named after a mythical combination of swan and goose, the Swoo was a Frankenstein's monster of a plane, part B-17D, part spare parts. It was patched together after suffering battle damage in the Pacific. Instead of being scrapped, it was rebuilt, reborn, really, with replacement wings, engines, and a new identity. It was a one-of-a-kind warbird, surviving long after its original squadron had been destroyed or grounded. From the opening days of America's involvement in World War II to the final flyover of peace, the Swoo served continuously. It never became famous like the Memphis Belle, but it earned a cult following among its crews, who viewed it as a lucky charm, a survivor, and a flying contradiction. It wasn't sleek, it wasn't pretty, but it refused to die. General George Brett used the Swoo as his personal transport plane for a time, which gave the odd bird a brush with strategic importance. But its legacy rests more in its stubbornness than its resume. It became a symbol of what wartime engineering often is: improvisational, ugly, and just good enough to get the job done. It's still around, actually, parked in a museum hangar, disassembled but not forgotten. Like a relic from an era when surviving was enough to be legendary. And if you think a misfit bomber deserves its own band, you're not far off. The military actually thought of that too. Which brings us to their first official concert tour, a band with uniforms and marching orders. The U.S. military's first official band was established in 1798. When you think of military operations, you probably don't think of woodwinds. But from its earliest days, the U.S. military understood something deeply primal. War needs rhythm. Enter the first official military band, formed in 1798, the same year John Adams created the Department of the Navy. They weren't armed with muskets. They came bearing trumpets, fifes, and the ability to play Yankee Doodle, with enough flair to inspire boys to enlist and officers to pretend their feet weren't freezing. The role of military bands went far beyond parade ground pomp. In the field, they provided morale. In ceremonies, they signaled structure and hierarchy. In battle, they once served as literal communication systems, with drums and bugles used to relay orders over the noise of gunfire. And in peacetime, they were the government's touring rock stars, showing up at state functions, funerals, inaugurations, and more than a few awkward diplomatic receptions. These musicians weren't just background noise. They were enlisted service members with real ranks, real duties, and real discipline. Some even saw combat. Their music was sometimes the last thing soldiers heard before charging toward cannon fire. So yes, the U.S. military started with music. And in one war, that music followed them straight into the halls of a castle, where the Marines got a song, a legend, and a bloody footnote called Chapultipek. The U.S. Marine Corps hymn, From the Halls of Montezuma, references the Battle of Chapultipek during the Mexican-American War. It's the first and oldest official song in the U.S. Armed Forces, and it begins with a line that sounds like something out of a history textbook filtered through a rock opera. From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. The first part? That's a direct nod to the 1847 Battle of Chapultipek, fought during the Mexican-American War, when U.S. Marines stormed a hilltop fortress in Mexico City. They fought uphill under heavy fire against deeply dug-in defenders and somehow managed to take it. Chapultipek Castle was no symbolic target. It guarded the capital and was fiercely defended, including by a group of teenage military cadets now considered national heroes in Mexico. The Marines, meanwhile, took the fortress at great cost, hoisted their flag, and cemented their role as the shock troops of U.S. expansionism. That victory, and its bloody symbolism, left a mark deep enough to become lyricized into Marine Corps lore. Never mind the awkward geopolitical legacy of invading another country's capital. For the Corps, it was proof they could go anywhere, fight anyone, and leave their name etched into the bricks of a captured palace. And so the hymn stuck. Played at every Marine ceremony, hummed in every boot camp shower, etched into medals and monuments. Its irony is thick. A song of pride, born from a controversial war, where the triumph of one country became the national mourning of another. But history, like war, rarely asks permission before becoming legend. And if you think storming a castle with rifles is intense, wait until you hear what happens when the military teaches bees to sniff out explosives. The U.S. Army once tried to use bomb-sniffing bees. Yes, you read that correctly. Bees, not dogs, not machines, not even rats. Bees. In one of the most bizarre detours down the road of military innovation, the U.S. Army decided to investigate whether the common honeybee could be trained to detect explosives, specifically the scent of compounds found in bombs and landmines. Why bees? Because they have an extraordinary sense of smell, better than dogs in some cases. And unlike dogs, they're cheap, tiny, and don't require belly rubs or emotional support breaks. The idea was simple and mad all at once. Bees would be exposed to the target scent and rewarded with sugar water. Conditioned through Pavlovian mechanics, they'd be trained to stick out their tongues, a behavior called proboscis extension, when they detected the scent again. Theoretically, swarms of these micro-buzzing bomb detectors could then be released into a field, and their behavior monitored. It kind of worked, but field deployment raised logistical challenges. Bees are hard to track. They don't respect borders, and they have this nasty habit of stinging things that annoy them, like, say, soldiers. Also, you try explaining to a combat unit that their safety depends on the mood of several thousand insects. So the idea never made it out of the experimental phase. But the dream lingers in Pentagon footnotes and DARPA labs. After all, if you can train bees to find bombs, what can't you do? Intercept drones with eagles? Funny you should ask. The U.S. military once considered using trained eagles to intercept enemy drones. Birds of prey are nature's guided missiles. They strike with precision, at speed, with claws like bone saws. So it wasn't entirely insane when the U.S. military, looking for ways to counter small enemy drones, considered turning to one of Earth's most ancient air superiority platforms, the Eagle. The idea was simple. Train Raptors to recognize hostile drones as threats and snatch them midair before they could drop bombs, record video, or spy on troop movements. Other countries were toying with the concept, too. After all, drones are fast but predictable. Eagles? Fast, agile, and terrifying. They also don't come with firmware updates. Training began. Eagles were conditioned to spot, pursue, and take down flying objects. The results were impressive, until they weren't. Because birds aren't robots. They get tired. They chase squirrels mid-mission. They have no concept of geopolitics or friendly fire. And unfortunately, they're hard to armor. In the end, it was one of those ideas that looked better in theory than in practice. The skies are still contested territory. But for now, humans and machines will have to do the fighting. Although, for what it's worth, the Navy once had an even simpler solution to airborne pest problems: cats. Lots and lots of cats. The U.S. Navy used to have ship's cats to control rodent populations on board. Before sonar and radar, before GPS or nuclear propulsion, naval superiority often came down to something humbler and hairier: cats. For centuries, ships of the U.S. Navy kept feline crew members aboard not for morale, not for companionship, though they did that too, but for pest control. Rats were more than just an annoyance at sea. They were saboteurs with fur. They chewed through ropes, ate stored food, gnawed into hulls, and spread disease. In an environment where every supply mattered and every sealed container was sacred, rodents were an existential threat. Cats were the countermeasure. A ship's cat was both a working animal and a silent mascot. They prowled below deck, slept wherever they wanted, and earned their keep with every twitch of the tail. Sailors believed a good ship's cat brought luck, and that angering one could doom a voyage. So they were fed, protected, and occasionally decorated with tiny custom-made hammocks or unofficial ranks. If a cat adopted a ship, the crew generally adopted the cat. This tradition persisted well into the 20th century, but as naval tech advanced and ships became more sealed, sterile, and metal than wood and rope, cats became less common. Regulations tightened. Allergies were acknowledged. And suddenly there wasn't room for Mr. Whiskers on a guided missile cruiser. Still, the legacy lingers. Photographs of cats perched beside torpedoes, curled in sailors' bunks, or prowling the decks of Watuwo-2 destroyers are a quiet reminder. For all the machinery of war, it was often fur and instinct that kept the food supply safe. And if the Navy giving employment to cats seems wild, just wait until you hear about the Army's attempt to build a real-life death ray. The U.S. Army once attempted to create a death ray weapon in the 1930s. Long before the term laser entered the military lexicon, someone in the U.S. Army brass decided it was time to invent a weapon straight out of a Buck Rogers comic, a death ray. Not a metaphorical one. A real, honest-to-science beam of energy capable of frying aircraft midair, disabling engines, and possibly vaporizing enemies. The 1930s were weird like that, just technologically naive enough to believe science fiction could be duct-taped into reality. Several inventors were actually contracted to explore the idea. Some proposed high-powered radio waves. Others tried concentrated light or magnetism. The general premise was the same: harness invisible energy and turn it into battlefield dominance. Naturally, none of it worked. The prototypes couldn't generate the necessary intensity, aim reliably, or stay powered for more than a few seconds without melting their own components. Still, the Army's investment wasn't small. This wasn't a garage project. It was publicly funded experimentation by people who believed the future was just one spark away. And, to their credit, the desire to innovate wasn't wrong. It was just premature. Lasers wouldn't become practical weapons until nearly a century later, and even now, they're mostly fancy flashlights with attitude. The death ray era faded into obscurity, filed under optimism-induced delusion. The U.S. Coast Guard is the only military branch that can enforce civilian law. Most people think of the Coast Guard as a sort of nautical neighborhood watch, rescuing stranded boaters, intercepting smugglers, maybe yelling at yachts. But beneath the life jackets and rescue swimmers lies a unique legal authority no other military branch has: the ability to enforce civilian law during peacetime. While the Army can't arrest you and the Navy can't pull over your jet ski, the Coast Guard absolutely can. That's because it operates under the Department of Homeland Security in peacetime, not the Department of Defense. This means that they don't just guard coasts. They patrol, inspect, seize, and arrest. They can stop vessels, board them without a warrant, and conduct law enforcement missions inside U.S. territorial waters. If it floats and looks suspicious, the Coast Guard has jurisdiction. During wartime, they get folded into the Navy. But during peace, which is most of the time, they're out there doing the work of a dozen agencies: Customs, Border Patrol, Drug Enforcement, Search and Rescue, Maritime Safety, even Environmental Protection. In a way, they're the Swiss Army knife of U.S. Armed Services. Everyone forgets about them until a hurricane hits, a cartel ship pops up, or a freighter is about to collapse off the Jersey coast. And if you think balloon animals in the sky sound like fantasy, wait until you hear what happens when actual airplanes start trying to hook people off the ground with balloons. Oh, wait, we already did that. So now let's head into something slightly less absurd, but only slightly. Balloon-lifted planes. The U.S. military once experimented with skyhook systems where aircraft would hook onto balloons to lift people or cargo. Now we venture into the true realm of Wile E. Coyote meets CIA logistics, Project Skyhook. This was a real system developed by the U.S. military to extract personnel or cargo from behind enemy lines using balloons. The concept? A stranded operative would inflate a giant balloon attached to a tether. A specially equipped aircraft would then swoop in, snatch the tether with a giant hook, and yank the person, yes, a full-grown human, into the air and back to safety. It was as insane as it sounds, and it actually worked. Most of the time. The Skyhook system, also known as the Fulton Recovery System, was used in field tests and even deployed operationally in a few high-risk Cold War missions. A person would wear a reinforced harness, attach themselves to the balloon rig, and hope like hell that the pilot timing the snatch maneuver had steady hands and no hangover. The sudden jolt into the sky wasn't exactly gentle. Survivors described it as something between a slingshot and a minor religious experience. But it was faster than a helicopter and harder to detect. And in the Cold War, that was a winning combo. So yes, America once rescued spies with balloons and hooks. And somehow that's still only the second strangest thing the Army Corps of Engineers has done. Wait until you hear what they built in Panama. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers built the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal wasn't just a feat of engineering. It was a triumph of hubris, malaria, and good old-fashioned military logistics. After the French failed spectacularly in their attempt to dig a trench through Central America, leaving behind debt, death, and broken machinery, the U.S. decided it could do better. And who better to handle a quagmire of mud, disease, and international politics than the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers? The Corps took over in 1904. Their task? Cut a 50-mile swath through mountains, jungle, and swamp, and create a waterway that would connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Easy. It only required inventing entirely new construction methods, relocating entire communities, draining swamps, battling tropical diseases, and moving more earth than had ever been moved in human history up to that point. Under the leadership of men like Lieutenant Colonel George Washington Goethals, the Corps approached the canal like a military campaign. They set up hospitals, built worker housing, instituted a near-dictatorial labor schedule, and, crucially, finally figured out how to control yellow fever and malaria. The result was a working canal by 1914, a geopolitical game-changer, and one of the greatest logistical victories in U.S. military history. The canal reduced travel time between oceans from weeks to days and solidified American dominance in global trade routes. And yet, behind the ribbon-cutting ceremonies and heroic speeches lay a grim reality of labor exploitation, colonial attitudes, and thousands of dead workers, mostly Caribbean laborers whose stories are rarely told. Still, the engineering worked. The Corps proved once again that when given enough money, machinery, and power, they could quite literally move mountains. And speaking of mascots and machinery, did you know Strategic Air Command once had a cartoon bear? The U.S. Air Force's Strategic Air Command, SAC, had a mascot named Smokey Bear in the 1950s. Not the actual Smokey Bear. It's hard to imagine nuclear deterrence needing a mascot. But in the 1950s, the Strategic Air Command, responsible for America's long-range bombers and nuclear arsenal, had one. And no, it wasn't a grim-faced eagle clutching an atom bomb. It was a bear, a cartoon bear, named Smokey. Now let's clarify. This wasn't the forest fire prevention icon we all know, although the resemblance was suspicious. This Smokey wore a flight cap and sometimes held bombs. He was meant to project calm readiness, cool control, and lethal efficiency. all with the fuzzy friendliness of a children's book character. The Air Force figured that if you were going to put someone in charge of apocalyptic firepower, you might as well humanize the effort. Enter Smokey Bear, whose job wasn't just morale, it was branding. Internal newsletters, safety posters, training materials, all featured Smokey delivering reminders with a wink and a paw. This strange fusion of Cold War existential dread and corporate branding didn't last long. As public associations with the forest fire Smokey grew, the Air Force's bear quietly disappeared. But for a brief, surreal moment, America's nuclear sword was guarded by a mascot who looked like he belonged on a cereal box. And if you thought the military couldn't get any more absurd in the animal department, you haven't met their Camel Corps. Again. The U.S. Navy once had a Camel Corps in the 1850s to explore the American Southwest. That's right, again. Because while the U.S. Army had its own flirtation with camels in the desert, the Navy also dabbled in the idea of desert warfare camels. Why? Because the American Southwest was hot, dry, and impossible for traditional transport to navigate without bleeding resources. Ships, unfortunately, don't do well in sand. Camels, on the other hand, were practically born in it. So the Navy got involved, not because they planned to ride camels across Arizona, but because they were the logistical arm responsible for acquiring and transporting the animals from overseas. In 1855, Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, yes, that Jefferson Davis, approved the import of dozens of camels from the Middle East, and Navy ships were tasked with bringing the animals and their handlers, some of whom barely spoke English and had never heard of Texas, across the ocean. Once stateside, the camels proved effective and universally disliked. They spit, they stank, they freaked out the horses, and the soldiers hated them. Despite their endurance and strength, camels were too alien to integrate into the rank and file. After the Civil War, the program was scrapped. The camels were sold off, released into the wild, or sent to zoos. But a few wandered the desert for decades, feral reminders of a time when the Navy thought it made perfect sense to import livestock from the Ottoman Empire to solve America's desert logistics. And speaking of unusual beasts of burden, wait until you hear about the Army's canine cart pullers of World War I. The U.S. military once used dogs to pull carts and carry supplies during World War I. Before drones, before ATVs, before anyone thought to slap wheels on everything, there were dogs. In the trenches and behind the lines of World War I, the U.S. military, like many of its European allies, relied on man's best friend not just for morale, but for mobility. And no, these weren't just cuddly mascots. These were working animals, pulling carts laden with supplies, ammunition, and sometimes even wounded soldiers across terrain that was too muddy, too narrow, or too blown to bits for any wheeled vehicle to pass. The dogs were trained, disciplined, and surprisingly effective. In the shattered, shell-cratered no-man's land of France, a four-legged porter could often succeed where horses and men could not. They required less food, didn't panic as easily, and could move quietly, reducing the chances of attracting enemy fire. The soldiers came to rely on them, not just for work, but for the psychological boost of having a loyal, breathing companion in a world that often made no sense. Of course, not everyone approved. Some officers found it undignified. Others questioned the efficiency. But in war, practicality wins. If a mutt with a harness could get ammunition to the front line when a truck couldn't, the mutt got the job. It wasn't glamorous. No medals, no uniforms. But it was effective, and a weird precursor to the many other animal-assisted logistics programs that followed. Which leads us to the next logical step in tactical absurdity. Not dogs with carts, but jeeps with wings. The U.S. Army once tried to develop a flying jeep in the 1950s. The 1950s were a golden age of bizarre optimism, when the phrase, "what if it flew?" was asked far too often by men with access to government funding. One of the strangest offspring of this era was the Army's attempt to create a flying jeep. Officially known as the VZ-8 Air Jeep, it looked like something a kid might design after binge-watching cartoons and drinking motor oil. The goal was to build a light, nimble, vertical takeoff vehicle that could bypass mines, avoid rough terrain, and zip over the battlefield at low altitude. Think helicopter, but cooler. Think Jeep, but airborne. The Air Jeep had ducted fans, twin rotors, and the aesthetic appeal of a blender in mid-seizure. It could take off and land vertically, hover like a dragonfly, and seat 2 soldiers, presumably the most optimistic men in uniform. In testing, the Air Jeep worked, sort of. It could fly. It could hover. But controlling it was a nightmare. Pilots complained it felt like balancing on a sneeze. Its range was limited, its speed unimpressive, and the noise deafening. Worse yet, helicopters were getting better, faster, and cheaper. The flying Jeep quickly became obsolete before it was ever practical. And so it was grounded, forever stuck in the awkward category of almost genius. But for a brief, glorious moment, the Pentagon imagined an army of airborne dune buggies zigzagging over minefields. The dream died, but the absurdity lives on. Meanwhile, the Marines were keeping things more grounded. With an English bulldog named after their favorite war hero, the U.S. Marine Corps mascot is an English bulldog, commonly named Chesty. While the other branches dreamt of flying vehicles and trained birds of prey, the Marines stayed loyal to their roots, grit, loyalty, and an unwavering appreciation for the scowl of a jolly dog. Enter Chesty, the English bulldog mascot of the U.S. Marine Corps, named in honor of Lieutenant General Louis Chesty Puller, the most decorated Marine in American history. Chesty, the dog, not the general, lives at Marine Barracks, Washington, D.C., wears a miniature dress uniform, and has more discipline than most recruits. His duties include attending ceremonies, greeting visiting dignitaries, and occasionally intimidating tourists with a slow-motion growl that suggests he knows what your ASIVOB score was. Why a bulldog? Because they're stubborn, tenacious, and built like a cannonball in fur, much like the Corps itself. And why Chesty? Because Puller remains a Marine deity, a walking contradiction of brutal leadership and dark humor. Naming a drooling, flat-faced dog after him is the kind of reverent sarcasm only Marines can pull off. The latest in a long line of Chesty mascots is treated with surprising seriousness. He gets promoted. He has a service record. He's held to standards of conduct. He's also been known to bark at high-ranking officers, which in the Marine Corps is basically a badge of honor. And while Chesty rules the barracks, others were busy plotting things far colder and more secretive, deep beneath the ice of Greenland. The U.S. military once experimented with Project Iceworm, an underground missile base in Greenland. You've heard of missile silos in the Midwest? You've heard of submarines with nukes lurking in the deep. But have you heard of the top-secret plan to bury nuclear missiles inside the Greenland ice sheet? Welcome to Project Iceworm, where the military's Cold War paranoia and boundless creativity combine to produce something that sounds more like the plot of a Bond villain's lair than an actual Department of Defense initiative. In the late 1950s, the U.S. Army came up with a plan to construct a vast network of tunnels beneath the Arctic ice cap, over 2,500 miles worth, housing hundreds of mobile nuclear missiles. The location? Northern Greenland, strategically positioned to strike the Soviet Union from the top of the world. To test feasibility, the Army built Camp Century, an underground base powered by a portable nuclear reactor, complete with tunnels, dormitories, a mess hall, and scientific labs. It was part military post, part icebound experiment. The public was told it was a scientific research station. The reality was much icier. There was just one problem: ice moves. The shifting glacier deformed the tunnels faster than anyone predicted. The base was unstable. The plan was abandoned. Today, Camp Century lies buried, entombed in ice, along with its secrets and its radioactive leftovers. And if you thought underground missile cities were cold, just wait until sailors start throwing parties for the equator. The U.S. Navy once had a tradition of crossing the line ceremonies for sailors. Crossing the equator for the first time. Leave it to the Navy to turn a perfectly reasonable geographical milestone into a full-blown nautical hazing ritual. For centuries, the crossing the line ceremony, marking a sailor's first time sailing across the equator, has been a bizarre theatrical rite of passage. And by bizarre, we mean equal parts absurd pageantry and controlled chaos, with just enough saltwater superstition to make it feel meaningful. The ceremony transforms the ship into a floating carnival of maritime madness. Veterans of the equator, known as shellbacks, preside over the event dressed in ridiculous costumes as King Neptune and his court. First-timers, or pollywogs, are forced through a gauntlet of embarrassing, messy, and physically demanding challenges. Crawling through garbage, mock trials, forced declarations of loyalty, and public humiliation, all while wearing makeshift costumes and dodging buckets of slop. The ritual serves no actual purpose other than to create a shared experience so surreal that even war feels more rational by comparison. It's a morale booster, a tradition, a moment where rank and dignity dissolve into maritime theater. And once you've completed it, you're a shellback for life, forever bonded with others who were once forced to kiss a greasy belly dubbed the royal baby. While modern safety regulations have dialed back the more sadistic elements, the tradition lives on, slightly sanitized, but still completely unhinged. It's the kind of thing that could only exist in a place where boredom, hierarchy, and oceanic vastness intersect. And if you think flinging sailors into ritual humiliation is strange, wait until the Army tried flinging actual soldiers over obstacles using, no joke, giant slingshots. The U.S. Army once considered using giant slingshots to launch troops over obstacles. When engineers and generals share a room long enough, bad ideas get PowerPoints. Case in point, the U.S. Army's brief consideration of using massive mechanical slingshots, yes, like the ones in Saturday morning cartoons, to launch soldiers over obstacles such as rivers, barbed wire, or enemy defenses. Because nothing says tactical advantage like hurling a human body through the air and hoping for the best. The concept hinged on a simple but catastrophic idea. If you can't go through the obstacle, why not fly over it? These weren't rubber-band slingshots, mind you. They were spring-loaded or pneumatic contraptions designed to yeet fully equipped soldiers through the air like weaponized rag dolls. In theory, it was fast. In practice, it was disaster on stilts. Field tests produced mixed results. Landing was unpredictable. Injuries were frequent, morale unmeasurable, but probably very, very low. And coordination under combat conditions? Non-existent. Shockingly, the plan never made it into widespread use. But it does live on in the blooper reel of military history as one of those ideas where ambition wildly outran common sense. And while the Army shelved their soldier-flinging trebuchets, they didn't give up on ambitious air projects altogether. Because just a few years later, someone at the Air Force asked, "What if we powered a bomber with a nuclear reactor?" The U.S. Air Force once had a program to develop a nuclear-powered aircraft. Somewhere in the mid-20th century, deep in the cocktail haze of Cold War ambition and atomic overconfidence, the U.S. Air Force launched one of its most dangerously creative projects, building a nuclear-powered airplane. The logic was straightforward. If you could stick a reactor into a submarine, why not into an aircraft? Nuclear propulsion could allow a bomber to stay airborne for days, even weeks, without refueling. In theory, the apocalypse would always have air cover. The project, known as the Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion ANP program, received serious funding. Engineers designed experimental reactors, shielded cockpits, and special airframes. The Convair NB-36H was created, a modified bomber with a working reactor on board, flown only to test shielding and feasibility. The thing was terrifying. A flying radioactive proof of concept that screamed, "We're not sure if this is safe, but let's find out at 30,000 feet. Spoiler, it wasn't practical. The shielding required to protect the crew made the aircraft too heavy. The reactor's heat output was hard to manage. And perhaps most importantly, nobody could figure out how to crash one without turning the crash site into a radiated wasteland. Eventually, the project was killed. Not because it failed, but because ballistic missiles were simpler, cleaner, and didn't risk turning Nebraska into a Chernobyl crater. But the very fact that it almost flew is a testament to the military's uncanny ability to mix innovation with recklessness in precisely equal parts. And speaking of airborne madness, we now return to a quieter time, when the skies were filled not with nukes, but pigeons. Again, the U.S. military once used carrier pigeons for communication in the early days of flight. Before satellites, radios, and encrypted messaging apps, there was the humble carrier pigeon, nature's original airmail. And for the U.S. military, particularly during the early days of aviation, pigeons weren't just pets or a last resort. They were part of the comms plan. When a plane went down or needed to send an urgent message without reliable radio contact, the pilot would grab the message capsule, strap it to the leg of a trained pigeon, and release it into the wild blue yonder. The bird, relying on instinct and its finely tuned internal GPS, would then make its way back to base, delivering messages faster and more reliably than many early radios. Carrier pigeons were especially vital in World War I, when portable communication tech was still in its technological diaper. One of the most famous instances involved a pigeon named Sher Ami, who delivered a critical message that saved nearly 200 American soldiers, despite being shot through the chest, blinded in one eye, and arriving with a nearly severed leg. She was awarded a medal and stuffed after death. Because in the military, even birds can become heroes and exhibits. As aviation advanced and radio systems improved, pigeons were slowly phased out. But they had a good run, longer than some aircraft models. In a strange twist of history, these birds were once considered high-tech, their tiny capsules containing battlefield secrets more valuable than gold. Of course, the military didn't stop innovating. After birds came rockets, and one in particular would change the nature of global warfare forever. The U.S. Army developed the first successful intercontinental ballistic missile, the Atlas. If the carrier pigeon was the humble beginning of military communication, the Atlas intercontinental ballistic missile was its thermonuclear exclamation point. Developed during the 1950s as part of the escalating Cold War arms race, the Atlas was the United States' first successful ICBM, capable of delivering a nuclear payload across continents. Unlike the pigeon, it didn't need to find its way home. Its job was to make sure someone else didn't have a home left. The development of the Atlas was nothing short of monumental. It required solving engineering puzzles nobody had even dreamed of in the previous war. Guidance systems, re-entry physics, cryogenic fuel storage, and the ethical dilemma of holding global annihilation in a metal tube. When it finally worked, it changed everything. Diplomacy, war planning, even space travel. Yes, a modified version of the Atlas rocket eventually sent John Glenn into orbit, but its military purpose was never ambiguous. It was designed to threaten, to deter, to hover silently in missile silos waiting for a command that would, hopefully, never come. It was the pigeon's evolutionary revenge, pure speed, silence, and mass destruction. Yet even amid the sterile calculus of mutually assured destruction, the military never stopped loving a good parade. Which is why the Marines, never ones to pass up showmanship, created a performance team so silent it made more noise than anyone else. The U.S. Marine Corps Silent Drill Platoon performs without any verbal commands, precision, intensity, swagger, and not a single shouted word. The United States Marine Corps Silent Drill Platoon is one of the most visually mesmerizing and viscerally intimidating displays in modern military performance. A 24-man rifle platoon that performs flawless, synchronized routines with M1 Garand rifles, all without a single spoken command. No barking orders, no cadence calls, just the slap of rifle butts against palms and the slow, echoing click of leather soles on pavement. It's more than theater. It's a display of total control, muscle memory, and the kind of disciplined synchronization that borders on the inhuman. Each move is timed to perfection. Each pivot is a visual metronome. The silence isn't just a gimmick, it's a declaration. We don't need words to dominate a space. The platoon was founded in 1948 and has since performed around the world. from presidential inaugurations to overseas embassies. Audiences often describe their routines as both hypnotic and unsettling, like watching a ritual that has forgotten its original purpose but retained all its power. And while it's ceremonial, make no mistake, every Marine in that unit is a trained infantryman. The rifles are real, the discipline is real, and the impression they leave is impossible to ignore. But if silence was golden for the Marines, the Army had something buzzier in mind, something involving bugs and biochemical warfare. The U.S. military once had a bug sniffing program to detect biological weapons, in the long, slightly terrifying tradition of asking animals to do the jobs we'd rather not. The U.S. military once asked bugs, yes, actual insects, to detect biological weapons. It wasn't science fiction. It wasn't a joke. It was a fully funded experiment in insect-based threat detection, where nature's tiniest creepers were recruited to warn us about invisible airborne doom. The logic was strangely sound. Insects have highly sensitive nervous systems and an ability to detect changes in the chemical composition of their environment, sort of like twitchy little biochemical sensors with wings. Scientists figured that if you could train or genetically modify them to respond to the presence of certain pathogens or chemical agents, you could deploy them across battlefields, cities, or strategic locations to act as early warning systems. Some proposals involved using bees that would exhibit specific behavior near biohazards. Others imagined micro-wired beetles transmitting sensor data. Insects would essentially act as scouts, buzzing into danger zones long before a human could arrive with a sensor rig and a Geiger counter. Of course, problems arose, like how to track the bugs, how to interpret their signals, and what to do when one of your key assets flies into a bug zapper. While the program never became widespread, it represented a peculiar intersection of entomology, paranoia, and desperation. Because when you're genuinely considering how to use a cockroach to save a city, the end is either very near or very classified. And as insane as insect espionage sounds, it still doesn't hold a candle to the Navy's attempt to take the concept of the aircraft carrier into the sky. The U.S. Navy once considered building flying aircraft carriers that would deploy smaller aircraft. In a bold leap from strategically absurd to comically overambitious, the U.S. Navy once flirted with the idea of airborne aircraft carriers, massive, slow-moving flying platforms that would launch and recover smaller planes mid-air. The vision was a kind of aerial mothership, hovering above conflict zones, immune to torpedoes, and radiating dominance from 30,000 feet. This wasn't just a doodle on a cocktail napkin. In the 1930s, and again during the Cold War, engineers designed prototypes and models that featured docking cradles, internal hangars, and complex trapeze systems that could allow small fighters to latch onto or detach from the airborne Leviathan. Think Independence Day, but with biplanes. In reality, the challenges were massive. The physics of in-air docking, the limited lift capacity of existing airframes, and the vulnerability of a slow-moving behemoth to enemy fire. The concept was tested with airships like the USS Akron and USS Macon, which could deploy small parasite fighters using a swing-down rig. And while it technically worked, it was precarious, weather-sensitive, and impractical. Eventually, the Navy decided that floating aircraft carriers on the ocean, where physics still had a mild grasp on reality, were the better option. But the dream of a flying war base still lingers in science fiction, proving once again that military ambition often overshoots the runway. And if sky fortresses weren't surreal enough, get ready for the land-based counterpart: squirrels, wearing cameras. The U.S. Army once used spy squirrels with tiny cameras attached. If you've ever stared at a squirrel and thought, "That guy looks shifty," you're not alone. Apparently, the U.S. Army once agreed with you, enough to test the feasibility of training squirrels to carry micro cameras into enemy territory. This was no cartoonish sideshow. It was part of a broader Cold War exploration of animal surveillance platforms, which included birds, cats, dolphins, bees, and, briefly, these twitchy-tailed rodents. The thinking went like this. Squirrels are agile, hard to detect, and can navigate tight spaces in urban environments. With the right training and a lightweight camera, they could sneak through fences, crawl through ventilation systems, and deliver real-time surveillance footage without anyone suspecting a thing. Because who questions a squirrel? They're just there, always watching, never blinking. Unfortunately, squirrels also have a few minor issues, like being extremely difficult to train, prone to erratic movement, and easily distracted by shiny objects and food wrappers. Test footage was often a dizzying mess of fur, leaves, and acorns. Valuable reconnaissance? Not quite. More like a nature documentary directed by someone having a nervous breakdown. The program, if you can even call it that, was quietly shelved. But the idea itself remains one of the strangest attempts to merge animal behavior with espionage tech. Just another page in the endless playbook of military solutions that were technically possible, but strategically hilarious. And if you thought squirrels couldn't get weirder, just wait until the military tried non-lethal brain guns. Yes, really. The U.S. military once tried to develop a brain gun that would incapacitate enemies with sound. There's a particular kind of military ambition that asks, what if we could make people drop everything and collapse without touching them? Enter the brain gun, a deeply experimental and mostly classified attempt by the U.S. military to weaponize sound, not as a distraction, but as a neurological disruptor. This wasn't just a loudspeaker, it was a theoretical weapon designed to mess with your brainwaves, your sense of balance, and maybe even your grip on consciousness. In essence, the brain gun was supposed to emit focused sound frequencies, often infrasound or ultrasound, that would interfere with the human nervous system. Depending on the tuning, it might cause disorientation, nausea, panic, or temporary paralysis. The goal: stop someone in their tracks without killing them. A humane weapon if you squint hard enough and ignore the screaming. Research into this kind of acoustic warfare ramped up during the Cold War, when non-lethal but incapacitating tech became an obsession. And while some variants of this idea, like long-range acoustic devices, LRADs, have seen limited use for crowd control, the so-called brain gun never made it past the testing and rumor phase. Side effects included permanent hearing damage, unpredictability, and the pesky issue of not knowing if you are disabling a combatant or just giving them an excruciating migraine. In the end, it was filed away alongside other strange dreams of victory through vibration. But the obsession with readiness, any time, any method, didn't go away. Just ask the Coast Guard, who live by it, unofficially but completely. The U.S. Coast Guard's unofficial motto is Semper Paratus, always ready. Semper Paratus doesn't have the brand recognition of Semper Fi, but for the United States Coast Guard, it's more than a motto. It's a mission statement disguised as a warning. Translated from Latin, it means always ready, and while it's not the official motto, the Coast Guard technically has none. It's etched into their culture like salt on a wind-whipped deck. This isn't just a feel-good slogan slapped on a recruitment poster. It's a daily operational philosophy. The Coast Guard doesn't get to choose its missions. It responds to them. Hurricanes, capsized boats, drug smugglers, oil spills, rogue shipping vessels, Arctic rescues. It's all fair game. There's no enemy front line. The ocean is the front line. And readiness isn't about drills. It's about grabbing your gear in the middle of the night and launching into a storm. Semper Paratus has appeared on unit patches, challenge coins, training manuals, and even the service's official march. It's their rallying cry, spoken quietly or shouted across crashing waves. In practice, it's the mindset that turns a small crew on a cutter into a rescue team, a security patrol, and a customs inspection all at once. Because while the other branches train for war, the Coast Guard trains for chaos. And they're always ready, even if that means training dogs to jump from helicopters, which brings us to Fort Robinson. The U.S. Army once had a war dog training center at Fort Robinson, Nebraska. Long before K-9 units were standard issue, the U.S. Army ran a full-scale war dog training center in the middle of nowhere. Fort Robinson, Nebraska. Starting in 1942, This unassuming patch of prairie land became ground zero for transforming man's best friend into a soldier's most loyal comrade. Thousands of dogs passed through its kennels, each one trained to perform specialized military tasks, messenger work, mine detection, sentry duty, and even full-on combat support. The dogs, mostly German Shepherds, Dobermans, and Belgian Malinois, were trained in obedience, aggression control, and tactical awareness. Some were taught to sniff out explosives. Others learned to carry messages across battlefields. A few were trained to launch surprise attacks or defend handlers with lethal precision. Fort Robinson became a boot camp for canines, complete with obstacle courses, mock combat drills, and rigorous psychological evaluations. No, really. Dogs were selected based on temperament, focus, and trainability. The center operated until 1946 and was responsible for preparing more than 17,000 war dogs during World War II alone. Many were deployed to the Pacific and European theaters, where they saved countless lives by detecting ambushes and mines, alerting troops to enemy movement, and even dragging wounded soldiers to safety. After the war, the program was scaled down, but its legacy lives on in today's military working dog units. Fort Robinson is now a historical park, but if you walk the fields, you're pacing over the ghost trails of canine warriors who once trained to serve and protect in the deadliest of circumstances. And if the idea of dogs in combat is intense, wait until you meet the pilots who fly without a net. Literally. The U.S. Air Force's Thunderbirds aerobatic team performs without any safety nets. In a world of redundancies, backups, and parachutes, the U.S. Air Force Thunderbirds fly like safety is a personal insult. These elite pilots, part of the Air Force's premier aerial demonstration team, perform death-defying stunts at hundreds of air shows worldwide, and they do it without the safety net of ejection rehearsals, redundant crews, or mid-performance second chances. Founded in 1953, the Thunderbirds showcase precision flying in combat aircraft, currently the F-16 Fighting Falcon, executing diamond formations, opposing knife-edge passes, and synchronized rolls at altitudes low enough to ruin a picnic. These stunts are rehearsed relentlessly. Timing is everything. One misplaced inch could mean catastrophe, and occasionally it has. Yet the performances continue, sharpened by the knowledge that there's no simulation here, no backup crew waiting in a trailer. What makes this even more impressive, or terrifying, is that each Thunderbird pilot is an active duty service member, not a civilian stunt flyer. Their moves are choreographed like ballet, but the stakes are terminal. There's no safety harness for a jet traveling 500 miles per hour, 10 feet from another jet. Just muscle memory, steel nerves, and the kind of institutional trust that borders on cult devotion. And the crowd, every time, eats it up. Because watching someone flirt with gravity and win never gets old. Of course, for the military, thrilling stunts aren't enough. At some point in the late 20th century, someone decided that perhaps what the battlefield really needed was a mind reader. The U.S. military once had a program to develop telepathic soldiers. You might assume that training soldiers to read minds was left to comic books and late-night infomercials. You'd be wrong. In the fever dream zone of Cold War experimentation, the U.S. military actually explored whether human consciousness could become a tactical weapon. The project wasn't officially titled Jedi Division, but it might as well have been. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, various defense agencies poured time and classified money into researching extrasensory perception, remote viewing, and yes, telepathy. The idea was to train soldiers to locate enemy installations, intercept thoughts, or even project their consciousness across space and time. Reports were written, experiments were run, men stared at goats. Literally. The results were inconsistent, sometimes eerie, often useless. But the sheer commitment to investigating psychic warriors speaks volumes about Cold War desperation. If it might work, it was worth trying. If a soldier could learn to kill with a thought, or just locate a missile silo by feeling a weird vibe, then the Soviets had to be beaten to it. The program was eventually shuttered, dismissed as pseudoscience with a taxpayer-funded budget. But it lingers in military lore as a perfect example of what happens when paranoia, science fiction, and government funding get drunk together. And if telepathic snipers weren't weird enough, let's sail into the ocean skies, where sea kites once threatened to replace traditional surveillance. The U.S. Navy once considered using sea kites to lift observation platforms. No, this isn't some whimsical steampunk novella. The U.S. Navy genuinely explored the use of sea kites, large, tethered aerodynamic devices designed to launch surveillance platforms high above the ocean. Think kites, but with military-grade paranoia. The idea was to use the ever-present wind at sea to lift sensors, radar systems, and even lightweight cameras far above the ship's deck. From that altitude, the surveillance equipment could see farther and more clearly than anything mounted on a mast. It was cheaper than deploying a drone, more persistent than a satellite, and less obvious than a giant radar dome. Sea kites had potential. They could be launched from small ships, didn't need fuel, and could theoretically remain aloft for hours or even days. But they came with drawbacks, like being at the mercy of wind direction, requiring constant adjustments, and occasionally crashing back onto the deck in a tangled mess of cables and shame. In the end, the Navy realized that inflatable blimps and shipboard drones were more reliable. But the sea kite idea never completely died. It resurfaces every decade or so, whenever someone stares at a kite string and thinks, what if this could spy on China? Next up, solar weapons. No, seriously. The U.S. Army once attempted to create a sun gun that would focus solar energy as a weapon. Somewhere between we need a bigger bomb and what if we turn the Earth into a magnifying glass, the U.S. Army flirted with the idea of building a literal sun gun. The concept, as wildly theatrical as it sounds, involved launching a giant mirror into space, large enough to reflect and focus sunlight into a concentrated beam, and then aim that beam at enemy targets on Earth. Let's pause and take that in. A solar death ray from orbit. The idea was based on principles that actually work in your backyard. Hold a magnifying glass over a leaf, and you get fire. Scale that up to a mirror several miles wide, and you get something between scorched earth policy and cartoon villain tech. While the original idea actually predates World War II and was allegedly floated by a Nazi scientist, the U.S. briefly considered whether the same concept could be militarized during the early Cold War. Unsurprisingly, the logistics were apocalyptic. The size, cost, and technology needed to place a stable, steerable solar mirror in orbit made the project wildly impractical. It never moved beyond theoretical white papers and speculative briefings, which is probably for the best. There's something about a weapon that turns the sky into a slow-burning laser that just doesn't scream measured response. Still, the fact that this concept was ever seriously discussed tells you everything you need to know about the era. If the sky wasn't already dangerous enough, someone wanted to make it consciously aggressive. Meanwhile, on the ground, the Marines were busy maintaining another kind of fire, one that involved dress uniforms, silverware, and a lot of tradition. The U.S. Marine Corps has a tradition of mess night formal dinners. For a branch known for storming beaches and chewing glass for breakfast, the U.S. Marine Corps takes its formal dinners surprisingly seriously. Known as mess night or dining in, these events are part ritual, part roast, and part deeply structured chaos. They're formal military dinners designed to reinforce camaraderie, tradition, and the unspoken rule that Marines must never take themselves too seriously, except when it's hilarious to do so. Picture this: Marines in full dress blues, a head table presided over by the president of the mess, an empty chair for fallen comrades, and a meticulously followed set of rules that includes toasts, jokes, challenges, and scripted chaos. There's also the grog bowl, a ceremonial drink that typically contains every disgusting liquid anyone can sneak in, sometimes flanked by a toilet bowl and sometimes by peer pressure. Violating the rules, like speaking out of turn or using incorrect protocol, often results in a trip to the grog. It's part theater, part team building, and entirely Marine, The evening is built on a foundation of military etiquette, but it's also a release valve. The contradictions are the point. Solemn toasts followed by impromptu skits, razor-sharp uniforms paired with stories about someone lighting a tent on fire. Mess night is less about what's served and more about who's at the table. It reinforces unity, honors tradition, and reminds everyone, officer or enlisted, that humor and honor can absolutely share a bottle of whiskey. Now, after dinner's done and the lights are dimmed, let's talk about the night sky and the glowing aircraft that once haunted it. The U.S. military once used glow-in-the-dark paint on aircraft for night operations. You'd think stealth would be the name of the game in night operations, but at one point in military history, the U.S. decided the smarter move was to make aircraft glow. Yes, actual glow-in-the-dark paint, applied to aircraft, on purpose. During the early stages of night flying, particularly in World War II, pilots faced the logistical nightmare of landing in pitch black, locating wingmen in the sky, or even finding their own aircraft on a darkened airstrip. So engineers proposed a luminous solution, phosphorescent or luminescent paint that could help pilots see key features of their planes in low light. The paint, usually applied to propellers, tail fins, or fuselage markings, allowed aircraft to be identified more easily at night, especially from above or behind. The idea was that a subtle glow could help avoid mid-air collisions or assist in tight formation flying. In theory, it made night operations smoother. In practice, it also made aircraft easier to spot if you happened to be looking for them from the ground. With anti-aircraft guns, the trade-off between visibility and vulnerability eventually tipped in favor of darkness. Radar, infrared, and more advanced navigational tech replaced the need for glowing paint. Still, for a while, the U.S. military genuinely flew into combat with planes that looked like they'd been cursed by a haunted rave. And as strange as that may seem, it was just another entry in the military's long and glowing history of solutions that illuminated one problem, while painting a big, neon bullseye around another. The U.S. Army's official song is "The Army Goes Rolling Along." When you picture soldiers marching in formation, boots pounding the pavement in perfect sync, there's a soundtrack playing in the background, whether you hear it or not. That soundtrack, officially and unapologetically, is "The Army Goes Rolling Along." Adopted in 1956 as the Army's official song, it has all the bombast of a college fight anthem with none of the subtlety. It begins with a verse that could double as a recruitment jingle, first to fight for the right and to build the nation's might, before launching into a rousing chorus that somehow makes "rolling along" sound like a conquest. The tune was adapted from the Caisson song, originally penned in 1908 by First Lieutenant Edmund Gruber. What started as a light-hearted tune sung by field artillerymen evolved into a ceremonial anthem meant to embody the spirit, legacy, and self-image of the Army. And that image? Big, loud, relentlessly forward-moving. The song is played at official events, graduations, and funerals. Soldiers are taught to memorize it during basic training, as if musical literacy is a requirement for war. And while it might not top the Billboard charts within the Army, it's sacrosanct. When that chorus hits, then it's hi, hey, the Army's on its way. You're not just singing. You're affirming a heritage built on marches, mud, and a questionable number of acronyms. And while the Army was marching to music, the Navy was busy turning fairy tales into tactical training with a little help from mermaids. Sort of. The U.S. Navy once had a mermaid school to train divers. No, this isn't a Disney crossover. The U.S. Navy once operated a training facility so surreal it came to be nicknamed the Mermaid School. This was not about mythical sirens or underwater singing competitions. It was about training human beings, specifically women, for underwater operations involving advanced diving, rescue, and survival techniques. And it was deadly serious. This specialized program involved breath-holding drills, underwater maneuvering, and mastering the kind of fluid grace required to operate in aquatic environments where traditional diving gear might not be practical. Some of the trainees were Navy divers, others came from different military backgrounds, or were civilians training for underwater roles in intelligence or rescue missions. What earned the school its nickname was the elegance of the training. Holding poses, streamlined movement, and the eerie sight of people swimming in perfect silence for long periods without scuba gear. It looked like ballet for survivalists. And in a weird twist of image management, it became an odd source of PR pride. Newsreels dubbed it mermaid training, and suddenly, something born out of underwater warfare took on an air of fantasy. But make no mistake, this was training designed to push the human body to aquatic limits, holding your breath for several minutes, swimming against currents, executing coordinated underwater procedures, all without panicking or blacking out. The Navy's Mermaid School eventually merged into broader diving programs, but the name, and the strange glamour attached to it, has never quite washed away. And while the Navy gazed beneath the waves, the military once cast its eyes toward the skies, using massive concrete dishes to hear what couldn't be seen. The U.S. military once considered using acoustic mirrors to detect enemy aircraft. Before radar revolutionized air defense, the U.S. military and others explored a far more analog approach to early warning. Giant ears made of stone. Known as acoustic mirrors, these massive parabolic concrete structures were built to capture and focus distant sounds, particularly the low-frequency hum of approaching aircraft engines. Imagine staring into a stone satellite dish the size of a small house and listening for the apocalypse. Placed along coastlines or strategic outposts, these acoustic mirrors were meant to function as early detection systems in an era when surprise air attacks were both real and terrifying. Operators would sit with stethoscope-like gear or place their heads at specific points in the dish to amplify and interpret incoming sound. A trained ear could supposedly tell the difference between friendly and enemy aircraft, single planes versus squadrons, and even estimate direction and distance. And it sort of worked, until it didn't. By the time a plane was loud enough to be heard, it was often too late. Worse, the rise of faster, higher-flying aircraft rendered the entire system obsolete almost overnight. Still, these mirrors remain haunting symbols of pre-radar desperation, massive architectural monuments to a time when listening hard enough might mean the difference between surviving the next attack or becoming the next crater. Coming up next, an elite Coast Guard unit that doesn't just float, they strike. The U.S. Coast Guard has an elite unit called the Maritime Security Response Team. For a branch that often gets typecast as the traffic cops of the sea, the U.S. Coast Guard has an ace up its sleeve that absolutely no one expects: the Maritime Security Response Team, or MSRT. These aren't your average life-jacketed search and rescue crews. These are highly trained, heavily armed, and borderline terrifying maritime commandos. Think SEAL team, but with jurisdiction and a flotation device. MSRT units are the Coast Guard's tactical response to high-risk threats: terrorism, piracy, hijackings, chemical or biological attacks aboard ships. Their job is to respond to the worst-case scenario with speed, precision, and a complete lack of hesitation. Their motto: Nox noctis est nostri. The night is ours. They train in close-quarters combat, vertical insertion via helicopters, fast rope boarding of hostile vessels, and dealing with chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear CBRN threats. These are the guys who rappel onto tankers in the dead of night while someone below is wiring explosives. They work with Navy SEALs, FBI, and international maritime forces. They are silent, fast, and not remotely interested in fame. Most Americans don't even know this unit exists, and that's probably the point. The MSRT operates in the shadows, at sea, far from the Hollywood lights. If you ever meet one, it's probably not going to be at a parade. And while they train in the physical world, another wing of the military once tried to operate in a less tangible realm, using thoughts as weapons. The U.S. Army once tried to develop a psychic spy program. At the intersection of LSD paranoia, Cold War desperation, and New Age mysticism, the U.S. Army hatched a plan so bizarre it still reads like satire: a real-life psychic spy corps. Yes, the Army spent actual money trying to train soldiers to see things with their minds. No binoculars required. This initiative, most famously known through the Stargate project, revolved around remote viewing, the alleged ability to perceive distant or hidden objects using extrasensory perception. Soldiers, intelligence analysts, and civilian psychics were placed in dark rooms and asked to visualize Soviet missile silos, secret hostages, or even alien spacecraft, all through focused concentration and loose sketching. Some claimed success. Drawings eerily resembled classified satellite imagery. Others drew blobs and trees and swore it meant something. Declassified documents revealed decades of tests, hit-or-miss results, and a steady stream of funding from agencies like the CIA and DIA. If it could yield just one high-value target, the thinking went, it was worth it. Eventually, after years of awkward memos and eyebrow-raising congressional briefings, the program was shuttered. No mind bullets, no psychic assassins. But for a strange, glorious window in U.S. military history, sit in a room and imagine the enemy was an actual job description. And speaking of flying into fantasy, the Air Force once skipped psychic powers and tried to engineer UFOs on purpose. The U.S. Air Force once experimented with flying saucers as research vehicles. Yes, the United States Air Force once built actual flying saucers. Not the secret alien kind, but the military research kind that somehow looked exactly like the alien ships everyone was paranoid about. This wasn't a coincidence. It was an aerodynamic experiment known as Project 1794, and later, Avrocar. The goal? Vertical takeoff and landing. The vibe? Full-on Roswell cosplay. Developed in the 1950s in partnership with a Canadian company, the Avrocar was envisioned as a disc-shaped aircraft that could hover, maneuver in tight spaces, and serve as a fast response transport or combat vehicle. Its appearance was so stereotypically UFO that it might have been responsible for half the sightings during the era. On paper, it was brilliant. In the air, not so much. The Avrocar wobbled like a drunk dinner plate, had stability issues, and couldn't fly more than a few feet off the ground without risking aerodynamic implosion. Test pilots reportedly compared the experience to standing on a beach ball with a jet engine strapped underneath. Still, it was a sincere attempt at innovation, pushing the envelope of VTOL design decades before drones made it cool. And though the saucer never soared, its ghost lingers in every X-Files binge watch and every weather balloon excuse the government has ever offered. Next up, Arctic dog sleds. Because when all else fails, harness a few huskies and charge into history. The U.S. military once used dog sled teams for Arctic operations. Before satellite comms and all-terrain vehicles, Arctic warfare required something warmer, furrier, and far more loyal than a Jeep. Dog sled teams. For decades, especially during World War II and into the Cold War, the U.S. military relied on sled dogs to move supplies, personnel, and messages across icy terrain that would freeze the bolts off any standard-issue engine. When your enemies are frostbite, snowdrifts, and polar silence, dogs don't just help. You owe them your life. These weren't just fluffy mascots or novelty transport. They were essential assets for Arctic survival and operations, particularly in Alaska and Greenland. Teams of Alaskan Malamutes and Siberian Huskies were trained for precision hauling, emergency search and rescue, and even tactical scouting in remote zones where nothing with an internal combustion engine could survive for long. Sled dogs could traverse the kind of frozen wastelands that made compasses shiver and maps curl into themselves. During World War II, the Army even established specific dog training programs to prepare teams for deployment to snowbound posts. Their ability to operate without roads, fuel, or noise made them the perfect solution in an era when silence and mobility could mean the difference between life and death. As technology advanced, snowmobiles, tracked vehicles, and eventually drones, dog teams became more of a tradition than a necessity. But their legacy didn't vanish. The military still acknowledges their service, and in many Arctic survival training scenarios, their techniques are still taught. Because sometimes when the GPS fails and the oil freezes, what you need isn't high-tech. It's a pack of snarling, snow-eating professionals with paws. And while sled dogs ruled the snow, music still ruled the sea. Literally. Just ask the Navy, who thought no ship was complete without its own personal soundtrack. The U.S. Navy once had a ship's band on every major warship. It's hard to imagine the chaos of a floating war machine, stocked with explosives and radar, suddenly being filled with the sound of trombones. But for a significant portion of U.S. naval history, that was standard operating procedure. On every major warship, from aircraft carriers to battleships, the Navy maintained a full-time ship's band, a floating orchestra tasked with boosting morale, honoring ceremonies, and occasionally drowning out the existential horror of war with a snappy march. These bands were not minor additions. They had assigned quarters, a daily schedule, and instruments specially rigged to withstand the corrosive sea air. They played during mess, during flag raising, during Sunday services, and whenever the captain decided that morale needed a little brass-heavy encouragement. In port, they performed at diplomatic events and parades. At sea, they reminded sailors that not every sound had to come from a gun. More than just entertainment, the ship's band was a morale machine, a psychological buoy, and a strategic distraction. When your days are long and your nights are longer, a sudden blast of Sousa through the steel corridors can make life at sea feel, briefly, like something other than a floating prison. Eventually, the shipboard band tradition faded with budget cuts, space limitations, and the rise of recorded music. But the echoes remain. In ceremonial ports of call, when Navy vessels pull in, you might still hear the ghost of a tuba bouncing off the hull. Meanwhile, back on land, the Army had moved on from music to something far weirder, trying to build the first generation of combat robots. No, not tanks, actual robot soldiers. The U.S. Army once attempted to create robot soldiers in the early 20th century, long before Boston Dynamics made robots do backflips and threaten humanity with viral videos. The U.S. Army was toying with the idea of mechanical soldiers. We're talking early 20th century, before microchips, before even transistors, when the military began imagining autonomous or semi-autonomous machines replacing, or at least assisting, flesh and blood troops on the battlefield. Of course, the robots in question looked nothing like the sleek machines of modern warfare. These were clunky, gear-driven monstrosities made of steel, wires, and blind optimism. They waddled, they jittered, they sparked, and occasionally they caught fire. One such design was essentially a walking gun platform that could shuffle a few feet, raise a weapon, and fire, assuming the wind wasn't too strong. Military engineers experimented with remote-controlled gun carts, motorized mannequins, and clockwork devices meant to simulate guard patrols. Some were mounted on primitive treads, others on stilts. All were doomed to fail. But their creation marked the beginning of a century-long obsession with replacing humans in combat with machines that didn't eat, sleep, or ask why. While none of these robot soldiers saw actual combat, they laid the psychological groundwork for every drone, killbot, and exosuit being tested today. It turns out the fantasy of a tireless, obedient war machine is one the military has been chasing since before your grandfather's grandfather enlisted. And it all began with sputtering gears and patriotic pipe dreams. Because even in the 1900s, if the Army had a crazy idea, you could bet it would roll, rattle, or march straight into a Pentagon storage closet labeled "Too Soon." The U.S. Marine Corps motto is Semper Fidelis, always faithful. If you ask a Marine what Semper Fi means, you'll likely get a stare, a smirk, or a story. Maybe all three. Short for Semper Fidelis, Latin for always faithful. It's not just the Marine Corps motto. It's a binding contract, a whispered threat, and a kind of spiritual tattoo that doesn't wash off, even after the uniform's been folded for good. Adopted in 1883, Semper Fidelis isn't just about being loyal to the country. It's about being loyal to the Corps, to your unit, to your fellow Marines. to the long, bloody line stretching back to Toon Tavern in 1775. It's about gutting through whatever hell the world throws at you. Not because it's noble, but because you don't let your people down. That's the code. You'll hear it shouted in boot camp, mumbled at funerals, toasted at birthdays, and etched into gravestones. It's stitched into flags, muttered under breath in combat zones, and screamed across the parade grounds at Paris Island. It's the phrase you say when there's nothing left to say, when the mission sucks, the politics are confusing, and the only thing left to hang on to is each other. Semper Fi is simple, and that's what makes it unshakable. It means showing up, every time, no matter what. And while the Marines were perfecting loyalty, the military at large was experimenting with something stickier. Literally. Say hello to magnetic sea bombs. The U.S. military once considered using magnetic mines that would stick to enemy ships. In the eternal cat-and-mouse game of naval warfare, nothing says, "I hate your hull," quite like a bomb that clings to the side of your ship and waits. Magnetic mines were one of the sneakier innovations explored by the U.S. military, designed to adhere to the metal underbellies of enemy vessels and then detonate with devastating effect. These weren't your average float-and-pray sea mines. They were stealthier, deadlier, and personal. Some were planted by divers in covert underwater missions. Others were dropped from aircraft or attached using poles, magnets, and a lot of quiet courage. The key advantage? Surprise. Ships didn't see them coming. And even if they did, getting rid of them often involved either sending out a desperate diver with a knife or backing the ship into a sandbar and praying. The idea gained serious traction in the Cold War era, when submarine warfare and port sabotage were very real fears. Covert operations called for tools that could disable a vessel without an all-out naval assault, and magnetic mines were a grimly elegant solution. Of course, like many beautiful horrors of military tech, magnetic mines had their quirks. Ocean currents, false contacts, and corrosion often interfered. And while the concept didn't vanish, modern navies now prefer more advanced smart mines with sensors and microchips over old-school magnets. Still, the thought of a silent swimmer in the dark, armed with a ticking magnet, is the kind of thing that makes naval commanders flinch in their sleep. And speaking of sleep-deprived mariners, let's talk about the Coast Guard's secret Arctic weapon, ice pilots. The U.S. Coast Guard once had a program to use ice pilots to navigate through frozen waters. If you've ever tried steering a ship through solid water, you'll understand why the U.S. Coast Guard once employed a breed of sailor that bordered on myth, the ice pilot. These weren't just experienced mariners. They were navigational savants trained to read ice flows like other men read maps. Their mission? Guide vessels through the treacherous, ever-shifting obstacle course of frozen sea, from the Arctic Circle to the winter-locked Great Lakes. Operating icebreakers and support ships in sub-zero conditions requires more than just horsepower. It takes a deep, intuitive understanding of ice behavior, its density, drift, crack patterns, and how it'll respond to hull pressure. Ice pilots could see where ice was weakest, steer toward pressure ridges to avoid becoming trapped, and make real-time judgments that determined whether a mission succeeded or got swallowed by nature. These pilots were often Coast Guard veterans with years of cold water sailing experience. Their training included simulations, survival courses, and joint operations with scientists and climatologists. Many operated during Cold War patrols in the polar regions, ensuring the U.S. maintained a strategic presence in places where a single miscalculation could leave you encased in ice until spring. Today, modern sensors, satellite imaging, and advanced hull designs have reduced reliance on human instinct. But the legacy of the ice pilot remains, a reminder that no matter how advanced your tech, sometimes the best path forward is a guy with a beard, a compass, and the uncanny ability to whisper to glaciers. Coming up, horses in World War II. Yes, that was a thing. The U.S. Army once had a horse cavalry unit that served in World War II. By the time World War II rolled around, tanks, planes, and mechanized infantry had already rendered the image of a saber-wielding cavalry charge a dusty relic of the past. Or so we thought. In reality, the U.S. Army still had horse-mounted units active at the beginning of the war, and yes, some of them actually deployed into combat zones. The most famous example? The 26th Cavalry Regiment of the Philippine Scouts. Comprised of Filipino troops under U.S. command, they carried out what is considered the last horse-mounted charge in U.S. military history. In January 1942, facing advancing Japanese forces, the 26th executed a cavalry charge near Morong, Luzon. It worked. Briefly, the moment was heroic, desperate, and utterly anachronistic. A living artifact galloping headfirst into the mechanized horror of the Pacific Theater. Stateside, the Army maintained mounted units for reconnaissance, patrolling, and ceremonial purposes into the early 1940s. Even as tanks became standard, horses remained surprisingly useful in rough terrain, especially in regions where trucks could barely crawl. Mountain units in Italy, and even some OSS operations in rugged areas made occasional use of horses when fuel and rubber were luxuries. By 1944, most cavalry units had been disbanded or converted into mechanized troops. But the legacy lingered. The horse soldier faded not with disgrace, but with a strange dignity, outpaced by progress, yet refusing to go quietly. And if galloping into machine gun fire sounds like a rough gig, wait until you hear what the Air Force was experimenting with. Bombers shaped like boomerangs. The U.S. Air Force once developed a flying wing bomber design. To the untrained eye, it looked like a boomerang mated with a spaceship. To engineers, it was the future. In the 1940s and 50s, the U.S. Air Force pursued a radical departure from traditional aircraft design with the development of flying wing bombers. Planes that had no fuselage, no tail, and barely any logic if you weren't a physicist. Northrop led the charge with their YB-35 and YB-49 prototypes. These sleek, UFO-like behemoths promised better aerodynamics, longer range, and reduced radar profiles. They were futuristic, daring, and downright eerie as they cut through the sky in total silence. And they flew. Sort of. Flight tests were promising, but riddled with instability issues. Turns out, removing a plane's tail might make it aerodynamic, but it also makes it act like a drunken stingray. Pilots reported difficulty controlling pitch, yaw, and their own heart rates. Even with the genius of Jack Northrop behind the project, the flying wing just wasn't quite ready for prime time. The Air Force canceled the program in favor of more conventional designs. Still, the idea wasn't dead. It just needed to wait for computers to catch up. Decades later, the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber would resurrect the concept with digital flight controls and radar-evading magic, making the flying wing the ultimate comeback story in aviation. And speaking of strange projectiles, let's rewind to a simpler time, when soldiers used rifles not just to shoot bullets, but to send messages. The U.S. military once used message capsules fired from rifles. Forget texting, forget radios. When the situation was chaotic, communications were down, and yelling across a battlefield wasn't a viable option. The U.S. military once used a more ballistic form of messaging. Capsules launched from rifles. Think of it as battlefield mail by way of small explosions. These capsules, metal or reinforced paper tubes, were loaded into special adapters or launchers fixed onto the muzzle of a standard rifle. Once fired, they arced across the sky and hopefully landed somewhere near their intended recipient. Inside, orders, coordinates, status updates, anything that needed to travel fast without risking a runner or relying on a radio jammed by enemy interference. It was a crude but often effective method, especially in environments like trench warfare, dense jungles, or mountainous terrain, where line-of-sight communication was impossible. Some capsules were even color-coded or rigged to release smoke on impact, making them easier to find. Of course, accuracy was limited. Wind, gravity, and general battlefield chaos didn't exactly lend themselves to postal precision, and the occasional misfire or rogue trajectory meant more than one soldier probably got an urgent message embedded in a tree, or worse, his leg. Still, in an age before digital, when communication was a gamble and silence was deadly, Message rifles were a creative solution. They weren't elegant, but neither is war. The U.S. Navy once had a singing sailor competition. Before karaoke night invaded every dive bar from Yokosuka to Norfolk, the U.S. Navy had its own version of American Idol, minus the judges, and plus a lot more seafaring testosterone. During the mid-20th century, especially in the World War II and post-war eras, the Navy held official singing sailor competitions aboard ships and at bases, where enlisted personnel would showcase their vocal chops for morale, entertainment, and the fleeting dream of not mopping the deck the next day. These weren't just informal talent shows. They were full-fledged contests, sometimes broadcast on Armed Forces Radio, or used to select performers for the Navy's entertainment tours. The winners might be shipped off voluntarily to join official Navy bands or perform in shows that toured bases and even frontline posts. For some sailors, it was the closest they'd ever get to stardom. For others, it was just a temporary escape from the grinding routine of naval life. The performances ranged from patriotic ballads to swing tunes to barroom shanties, depending on the era and the audience. Some contestants were surprisingly good. Others were, let's say, enthusiastically average. But everyone participated with gusto because, let's be honest, if you had the choice between singing in front of your shipmates or chipping paint in the boiler room, you'd pick the mic every time. Today, remnants of this tradition survive in variety shows, base talent nights, and the occasional Navy TikTok. But back then, it was community, escapism, and competition rolled into one. A way to remind everyone on board that, beneath the uniform and the regulations, sailors still had a voice. Of course, not all naval experiments hit the right note. Some hit you in the inner ear and made your brain feel like it was melting. That's what happens when the Army plays around with disorienting sound. The U.S. Army once attempted to create a sonic weapon that would cause disorientation. If the military can turn light into a laser and send into a bomb detector, it was only a matter of time before they tried turning sound into a weapon. Enter the sonic disruptor, a non-lethal high-decibel weapon developed by the U.S. Army to incapacitate or scatter enemies by overwhelming their senses. The concept was rooted in basic science. Sound waves at certain frequencies can cause discomfort, nausea, confusion, or even unconsciousness. The Army theorized that by amplifying these frequencies and projecting them at targets, they could create a weapon that disabled without killing, a humane deterrent, in theory. The result was a variety of prototypes, including directional speakers, subsonic blasters, and so-called pain rays, that made eardrums dance to the rhythm of dread. Testing revealed that certain frequencies caused vertigo, panic, and even involuntary bowel movements, basically turning combat into a very loud, very messy ordeal. But the practical challenges were huge. The machines were bulky, power-hungry, and indiscriminate. Aim was tricky, especially in crowded areas. And let's face it, no one wants to be remembered as the guy who ended up in military court because he deafened half a village with a noise cannon. While sonic weapons never became standard issue, they did lead to more refined tools like LRADs, long-range acoustic devices, now used in crowd control and ship defense. But the dream of a sci-fi style sound wave gun that stops an enemy cold still lingers in classified files and DARPA whiteboards. Still, sometimes the best way to disarm a man isn't with a weapon, but a waltz. Just ask the Marines at their annual birthday party. The U.S. Marine Corps has a tradition of birthday balls to celebrate its founding. There are military traditions, and then there's the Marine Corps Birthday Ball, an annual event so sacred, so over the top, and so deeply embedded in Marine culture that it borders on religion. Every November 10th, from remote outposts to embassy barracks to hotel ballrooms draped in red and gold, Marines all over the world gather to commemorate the founding of their Corps in 1775. And they do it with cake, speeches, bagpipes, booze, and just enough emotional repression to keep things marine. The event features formal dress blues, a reading of General John A. Lejeune's birthday message, and a ceremonial cake cutting where the oldest and youngest Marines in attendance share the first slice. It's a symbolic passing of knowledge, tradition, and occasionally questionable frosting. But beneath the formality lies a deep, emotional core. The ball isn't just a party, it's a time capsule. A moment when every Marine, past or present, gets to remember why they wear the eagle, globe, and anchor. War stories are swapped. Toasts are made to the fallen. And for one night, even the toughest jarhead can get a little misty-eyed without losing face. It's part reunion, part ritual, part unspoken therapy session. Because in the Marine Corps, tradition isn't just preserved. It's celebrated with bayonet-sharp precision and ballroom-grade pomp. And after the last slow dance and the final round of drinks, one thing's guaranteed. The Corps may age another year, but its swagger remains forever young. Just like the tech they're now eyeing, armor that flows like liquid but hardens like a fist. The U.S. military once considered using liquid armor that would harden on impact. Somewhere in the Pentagon's never-ending sci-fi wish list, nestled between invisibility cloaks and jetpacks, sits a beautiful paradox. Armor that flows like water until it gets hit. This wasn't a metaphor. It was science. The U.S. military actually explored a material known as liquid armor, a futuristic substance that could bend like fabric, but instantly harden upon impact, turning soft bodysuits into bullet-resistant cocoons. The secret ingredient? Shear thickening fluid. That's a fancy way of saying stuff that gets mad when you punch it. These fluids behave like a liquid under slow movement, but turn rigid under high-velocity stress. Imagine dipping your hand into syrup until you slap it, and suddenly it hits back. Researchers looked into integrating this tech into standard military fabrics, creating uniforms that would feel flexible but transform into protective barriers when struck by bullets, shrapnel, or a swift knife jab. It was lightweight, low bulk, and almost too good to be true. And as it turns out, it kind of was, at least for now. While the prototypes showed promise, scaling it for full-body, battlefield-ready gear proved trickier than expected. The fluid had weight issues, temperature sensitivity, and needed to be perfectly distributed to avoid weird floppy gaps in protection. Still, the dream hasn't died. Liquid armor continues to be researched, especially for specialized uses, riot shields, protective gloves, even bomb disposal suits. It's the ultimate fantasy, clothing that reacts faster than fear. Because the best defense sometimes isn't steel or Kevlar, it's science that stiffens under stress. And while this tech was meant for futuristic foot soldiers, the Coast Guard already deals with a far more ancient challenge, moving through solid water. The U.S. Coast Guard operates the nation's only icebreakers in the Arctic. While the Navy flexes its muscles in warm water war games, the U.S. Coast Guard quietly cracks through the frozen roof of the world. They're not just rescuing stranded sailors or intercepting smugglers. They're running the nation's only operational icebreakers in the Arctic. Yes, the same Coast Guard some people confuse with lifeguards operates some of the most powerful ice-breaking vessels on Earth. These leviathans, hulking ships like the Polar Star, are built not for speed, but for brute force. Their hulls are reinforced, their bows are angled, and their engines are engineered to shove, ram, and shatter ice that's feet thick. It's violent, methodical, and somehow mesmerizing, watching a ship chew through a frozen sea like a mechanical battering ram. But this isn't just about science missions or high-latitude tourism. Icebreakers are strategic tools. They maintain access to critical Arctic routes, enforce U.S. sovereignty in contested waters, and support national defense initiatives in a region that's melting into geopolitical chaos. As other nations ramp up their Arctic presence, Russia, China, the Coast Guard is often the only American flag in those lonely latitudes. And they do it with underfunded, aging ships and skeleton crews who train to survive in one of the deadliest climates on Earth. Ice, in this case, is both battlefield and terrain. But if Arctic navigation sounds like a modern feat, consider that the U.S. Army was once scouting enemies from balloons. Yes, balloons. The U.S. Army once used balloon observers to spot enemy movements. Before spy planes and satellites, before radar hummed across the heavens, the U.S. Army relied on something a little more whimsical. Balloons. Not the party kind, of course. These were gas-filled observation balloons, tethered to the ground and occupied by daring, or possibly deranged, soldiers tasked with one job: float into the sky and watch the enemy from above. These balloon observers were a real fixture of military operations from the Civil War through World War I. Suspended hundreds of feet in the air, they carried binoculars, cameras, signal flags, and nerves of steel. Their job was to track troop movements, locate artillery positions, and provide live intel to ground forces, all while swaying in the wind like a sad parade float on the edge of hell. Communication was often done through telegraph wires that ran down the balloon's tether, or by dropping message tubes. Sometimes they'd even shout. Subtlety was not the priority here. Of course, balloons were giant, slow, and incredibly flammable. Enemy snipers loved them. Fighter planes hated them, but were ordered to take them out anyway. The Balloon Corps eventually evolved into the Army Air Corps and then the Air Force, but their bizarre legacy remains. An era when the most cutting-edge recon tech was a guy in a wicker basket with a telescope, praying the wind didn't pick up. Coming next, battlefield weather modification. Because why wait for the storm when you can make one? The U.S. Air Force once had a program to develop weather modification technology. If controlling the weather sounds like the kind of thing a Bond villain would do from a mountain fortress, you're not wrong. But the U.S. Air Force beat them to it, just without the dramatic cape. During the Cold War and well into the Vietnam era, the Air Force actively explored and partially implemented weather modification as a military strategy. They weren't just watching the skies, they were trying to own them. The idea was simple in theory and deviously complex in practice. Could you create rain to bog down enemy troops? Could you seed clouds to wash out supply lines? Could you make a flood, or at least a thunderstorm, on command? In the 1960s, Project Popeye sought to do exactly that over Southeast Asia. Aircraft dropped silver iodide into cloud systems to increase rainfall along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, with the intent of turning a dirt path into a swampy hellscape. The project's unofficial motto? Make mud, not war. It worked, sort of. The clouds did what clouds do. Sometimes they rained, sometimes they ignored the memo. But the effort was classified, ongoing, and very real. The operation continued for years before the details leaked to the public, prompting outcry and the eventual banning of weather modification for military use under international law. Yet, the dream never fully died. DARPA, black budget contractors, and every backyard conspiracy theorist kept whispering about geoengineering and atmospheric manipulation, because deep down, the idea of weather as a weapon is too seductive to abandon completely. Even today, when you see a sudden downpour on an otherwise sunny battlefield, there's a part of the Pentagon that probably wonders, could we take credit for that? Of course, long before weather control, the military just relied on light, literal light, to communicate across vast distances. Enter the signal lamp. The U.S. military once used signal lamps for long-distance communication. In the age before satellites, fiber optics, and encrypted radio waves, there was a simpler solution for long-range communication: blinking at each other with very large flashlights. These were no ordinary flashlights, though. They were signal lamps, and for a time they were the cutting edge of military communication. First developed in the 19th century and used extensively through both world wars, signal lamps worked on a surprisingly low-tech principle. Operators used shutters or directional beams to send bursts of light in Morse code across distances. Ships would communicate across open water without the need for wire or radio. Infantry on distant hillsides could send strategic messages without uttering a word. Light, it turns out, was a reliable, if somewhat fussy, messenger. They were especially favored by the Navy, since they couldn't be jammed, intercepted, or misheard. Even if your enemy saw the light, they'd need to know Morse code and have a telescope to read it. In foggy or stormy conditions, however, the lamps were less effective. Blinking your heart out into a blizzard rarely produced results, and yet the signal lamp endured. Even today, They're still carried as backup on some vessels, a glowing reminder of a time when war could be won, or at least coordinated, with little more than light and patience. But lamps weren't the only communicative centerpiece on a ship. Sometimes a single bell could speak volumes. The U.S. Navy once had a ship's bell that was used for various announcements. When you're adrift at sea on a steel giant surrounded by nothing but blue and boredom, sometimes the most important sound isn't the engine rumble or the captain's orders, it's the bell. The ship's bell was a humble object, often mounted near the bridge or forecastle. But in naval tradition, it was the ship's literal voice. For centuries, the bell regulated life aboard the vessel. It marked the time, divided the crew's shifts into watches, and signaled critical events, fire drills, musters, meals, or even the approach of enemy vessels. Before digital clocks and PA systems, the bell told sailors everything they needed to know with a few crisp chimes. Its sound became a kind of sacred rhythm. 8 bells for a completed 4-hour watch, rung in specific patterns depending on the hour. There were bells for births, bells for deaths, bells for changes in command. When a ship was decommissioned, its bell was preserved as a piece of naval history, sometimes gifted to a museum or mounted in a school named after the ship. Even today, Navy tradition maintains that the ship's bell is not just a tool, but a ceremonial artifact. It's used to christen babies of sailors, to toll for the dead, and to remind every seaman that, even in a world of AI-controlled warships and cyber warfare, there's still room for a little ritual and a lot of brass. Coming next, a not-so-subtle dive into the Army's most unnatural ambition, genetically engineered super soldiers. Because, of course, they tried. The U.S. Army once attempted to create super soldiers through genetic engineering. It was only a matter of time. You can almost hear the conversation echoing through the marble halls of the Pentagon. What if we didn't just train better soldiers? What if we made better soldiers? Thus began the military's cautious, classified, and extremely controversial flirtation with genetic engineering. Welcome to the uncomfortable intersection of patriotism, biology, and the hubris of playing God. The idea was straightforward. Create warfighters with enhanced physical and mental abilities, stronger muscles, faster reflexes, sharper vision, higher pain tolerance, quicker recovery. The phrase super soldier wasn't just comic book fodder anymore. It was a line item in a defense research budget. Agencies like DARPA and military biotech contractors began exploring gene therapy, performance-enhancing injections, and even the potential for prenatal modifications. Yes, some proposals dared to consider genetically influencing a soldier before they were born. The ethical concerns? Massive. The scientific challenges? Even bigger. DNA isn't a clean menu you can reorder like lunch. And most attempts at tweaking it come with side effects, trade-offs, and unintended consequences. Think less Captain America, more The Fly. Still, various experimental programs ran simulations, trials, and hypothetical models. Some focused on isolating genes linked to endurance. Others looked at resilience to fatigue or psychological trauma. It was the biological equivalent of modding a game character, if the stakes included war crimes. In the end, most programs were shelved, veiled, or quietly renamed to sound less like science fiction. But the fascination never faded. Genetic soldier optimization still pops up in budget requests, buried beneath euphemisms like enhanced human performance or bio-augmentation research. And while the Army tried to rewrite evolution, the Marines, as always, stuck with the classics. Grit, grit, and just a little more grit, with a dash of theatrical flair. The U.S. Marine Corps has a tradition of spirit and swagger. No branch of the U.S. military cultivates its mythology quite like the Marine Corps. You don't join the Marines to get a job, you join to become a legend. And that legend is built not just on battlefields, but on an ethos summed up in 2 words: spirit and swagger. This isn't about chest-thumping bravado. Well, not entirely. Spirit and swagger in the Marine Corps is a kind of cultivated defiance, an unwavering pride that bleeds through every uniform crease, every salute, every 20-mile forced march. It's the way Marines carry themselves in a formation or a bar. It's the unspoken dare in their posture that says, I may not be the biggest, but I'll be the last one standing. This tradition is drilled into recruits from day one. You don't just learn tactics, you learn attitude. You're taught to take pride not just in the Corps, but in your place within it, no matter how small. A supply clerk has swagger. A cook has spirit. A private standing gate watch at 3 a.m. on Christmas morning, still strutting like a demigod in camis. And it's not just internal. This energy projects outward into everything the Corps touches. That's why Marine recruiting commercials look like high-octane Olympic trials. It's why every Marine says "oorah" like it's a curse and a benediction. And it's why other branches both mock and secretly envy them. But while Marines were cultivating their legacy the old-school way, the Pentagon was busy playing digital God with a different concept entirely, sending hundreds of robotic killers into the sky at once. The U.S. military once considered using drone swarms in the early 2000s. At some point in the early 2000s, a military strategist probably watched a nature documentary about locusts and thought, yes, that, but with explosives. Thus began the era of drone swarm theory, an idea that sounded absurd, brilliant, and horrifying all at once. Unlike single expensive UAVs like the Predator or Reaper, a drone swarm would consist of hundreds or even thousands of tiny, cheap, semi-autonomous drones launched simultaneously. Each drone would have a limited function: surveillance, jamming, targeting, or small-scale destruction. But together, they'd behave like a hive mind, self-organizing, self-correcting, self-aware, to a degree. The idea was tactical overload. No missile defense system could handle all of them. No enemy HQ could respond fast enough to 100 micro-assassins descending in coordinated waves. They could fly under radar, crash into vehicles, or hover near enemies like lethal hornets. Swarm warfare promised an entire paradigm shift, from brute force to elegant chaos. Of course, the challenges were massive. Communication bandwidth, AI reliability, interference, the occasional swarm getting bored and attacking its own base like a rogue Roomba. But the vision persisted. By the end of the 2000s, DARPA and the Air Force had run multiple test flights, showing it wasn't just possible, it was terrifyingly effective. And unlike so many military ideas from that era, this one didn't die on the drawing board. Drone swarm development continued. And today, it's no longer a what if, but a when. Coming up, the Coast Guard's quiet war on international drug empires. Not flashy, not cinematic, just deadly efficient. The U.S. Coast Guard has a specialized unit for drug interdiction. If you've ever imagined the Coast Guard as a bunch of suntanned guys in life jackets pulling over pleasure boats for expired flares, well, allow us to introduce you to the real side of the service. Deep within the Coast Guard's layered command structure exists a group of highly trained operators who don't just intercept smugglers, they hunt them. Welcome to the Drug Interdiction Specialists, the branch's not-so-secret weapon in the war on narcotics. These units are embedded across the Caribbean, Pacific, and Gulf of Mexico, often riding shotgun with U.S. Navy ships or partnering with international forces. Their job is to detect, pursue, and board vessels suspected of drug trafficking. And these aren't casual encounters. We're talking full-speed chases, nighttime boarding operations in open water, and the occasional shootout with cartel-backed crews who really don't want to go to prison. One of their most cinematic tools? High-speed pursuit boats launched from the back of moving cutters, complete with .50 caliber mounts and radio-honed targeting systems. In many cases, these specialists are also trained in helicopter deployment, fast roping onto drug subs, yes, cartel-made submarines, or fleeing speedboats with names like El Diablo and Wet Asset. They've intercepted billions in cocaine, heroin, and fentanyl over the last 2 decades, far more than most people realize. And they do it all while operating under comparatively tiny budgets, limited personnel, and almost no public recognition. Because while the DEA investigates, the Navy deters, and Customs watches, It's often the Coast Guard that catches. Quietly, efficiently, and very, very fast. Of course, in a much earlier war, when the battlefield wasn't the ocean but a rat-infested trench, another kind of specialist tool was in play. A simple invention that helped you not get shot in the face. The U.S. Army once used trench periscopes to observe enemy lines safely. Trench warfare was less about heroism and more about surviving long enough to get trench foot. It was cold, wet, claustrophobic, and worst of all, if you popped your head up to see what was going on, there was a decent chance you'd lose it. Enter the humble trench periscope, a simple tool that allowed soldiers to see over the parapet without becoming a sniper's lunch. The design was minimal. 2 mirrors mounted at 45-degree angles inside a wooden or metal tube. Stick it up over the edge of the trench, and suddenly you had a view of no man's land. Enemy movements, shell craters, troop formations, without exposing yourself to incoming fire. It was lo-fi battlefield espionage, and it saved countless lives. The periscopes were often handmade in the field. Soldiers would scrounge up broken mirror shards, scrap wood, and whatever else they could find. Later, the Army started producing them en masse, sometimes with adjustable lenses or collapsible poles for easier portability. They weren't perfect. The field of view was narrow. Image distortion was common, and if the enemy spotted your scope, they might aim for it. Still, it was a massive improvement over blind guessing or sacrificial peeking. Eventually, trench periscopes inspired other battlefield optics, rifle periscopes, armored periscopes for tanks, and eventually the periscopes we know from submarines. But it all began with scared, clever men trying not to die in a hole. Now take that basic principle, controlling something from afar without exposing yourself, and crank it up to 11. Because the Air Force didn't just want remote control. They wanted mental control. The U.S. Air Force once had a program to develop mind-controlled aircraft. Yes, it happened. No, it wasn't a Marvel movie. At one point, the U.S. Air Force seriously explored whether pilots could control aircraft systems with their minds. Not with joysticks, not with touchscreens, with brainwaves. This initiative fell under the broader umbrella of neurotechnology and brain-computer interface, BCI, research. A field that sounds like cyberpunk fantasy until you realize DARPA was quietly funding it decades ago. The goal: allow pilots to issue commands, navigate systems, or even fly using nothing more than focused thought. Push a missile lock with a blink. Shift course with a clench of mental will. Test subjects, usually trained pilots, wore EEG headsets that measured electrical activity in their brains. These signals were then processed by algorithms and translated into commands. Early prototypes worked only for simple tasks, moving a cursor, selecting a target, maybe activating a system. But even these basic tests hinted at massive potential. The implications were huge. In high-G environments where motion is restricted, or under intense stress where physical response is slowed, the ability to control systems without moving a muscle could be a game changer. Plus, pairing BCI with drones opened the door to thought-commanded swarm control. One operator mentally directing a legion of flying robots like a hive queen with a headset. Of course, the limitations were equally massive. Signal noise, mental fatigue, the fact that brains are messy and unpredictable things. But the groundwork was laid. And while mind-controlled fighter jets aren't standard issue yet, the research still simmers in Air Force labs and DARPA projects, one synapse at a time. Coming up next, smoke signals, shipcats, and yes, even invisibility cloaks. Because the military never met a weird idea it didn't try at least once. The U.S. military once used smoke signals for communication in some units. Before there were radios, before there were signal lamps, before soldiers were screaming into handsets trying to get actual on the line, there was smoke. Primitive? Absolutely. Effective? Sometimes. Stylish? Undeniably. In the early days of U.S. military operations, especially in remote or rugged terrain, some units, particularly scouts and native auxiliaries, used smoke signals as a basic line-of-sight communication method. Yes, actual smoke. Puffy, vertical messages written into the sky with fire and rhythm. And while Hollywood made it seem like 3 puffs meant danger and 2 meant bring snacks. In real life, the meeting was prearranged, unit-specific, and sometimes hilariously improvised. It wasn't Morse code. It was tactical charades with pyrotechnics. In the 19th century, particularly during westward expansion and frontier conflicts, smoke signals were one of the few tools that worked across canyons, valleys, and long stretches of enemy territory. You could alert other units of ambushes, troop movements, or safe passage. The technique was borrowed from indigenous American methods, which were far more advanced and nuanced than most early officers gave credit for. Of course, the risks were obvious. Smoke is not subtle. It announces your presence with the subtlety of a marching band in a minefield. Anyone who sees it can guess something's happening, whether they understand the code or not. Still, smoke communication endured for longer than one might expect. During jungle operations in World War II, and even in Vietnam, smoke grenades were occasionally used for signaling, in color-coded clouds this time, offering air units visual cues for pickups, bomb drops, or medevac zones. Old tricks, recycled with new tech. It turns out that sometimes the best way to be heard is to make a scene. Meanwhile, aboard Navy ships, there was another kind of signal, quieter, furrier, and deeply beloved by the crew. The U.S. Navy once had a ship's cat as an official mascot. In a world of naval traditions that include pollywog initiations, bell-ringing rituals, and rum-soaked toasts to Neptune, the ship's cat might seem like the least bizarre thing afloat. And yet, it's one of the most charming, if overlooked, corners of U.S. naval history. For decades, many American warships had official cats as part of the crew. Why? Rats. Lots of rats. Wooden ships, cargo holds, food stores, and rope lockers were rodent playgrounds. A single rat could chew through communications wire, contaminate food supplies, or gnaw away at insulation. So rather than launch a full-scale fumigation campaign, the Navy employed nature's oldest and most judgmental exterminator, cats. But cats didn't just earn their keep with claws. They became mascots, morale boosters, and miniature empires of personality on floating cities. Sailors gave them names, ranks, and sometimes uniforms. Cats lounged in captain's chairs, curled up in navigation rooms, and stalked the engine compartments like royalty inspecting their domain. Some, like Simon of HMS Amethyst, okay, British but honorary, even earned medals. American ship cats might not have received formal decorations, but they were loved, fed, protected during combat, and often buried with honors when they passed. By the 1970s, health regulations and modernization slowly pushed cats off ships. But the legacy remains. You'll still find naval museums with photos of famous felines, and more than one destroyer veteran, with a yarn about a four-legged stowaway who saved their bacon, and their rations. But while the Navy embraced whiskers and instinct, the Army was working on something decidedly less cuddly: full-blown invisibility. The U.S. Army once attempted to create invisibility cloaks. No, not a plot twist from Harry Potter. The U.S. Army, alongside other branches and defense contractors, has legitimately invested time, money, and questionable optimism into the idea of invisibility cloaks. The goal: make soldiers, tanks, or even entire bases vanish from sight. Not metaphorically, not figuratively. Literally vanish. Of course, no one was delusional enough to think they could wave a wand and disappear. But the term invisibility was military shorthand for advanced camouflage technologies. Adaptive materials that could bend light, mimic surroundings, or actively project what's behind an object to the viewer in front of it. In essence, not become invisible, but become undetectable. One early concept used fiber optic panels to display rearward-facing images on the front of vehicles, like a lo-fi invisibility TV set. Other approaches involved smart fabrics with embedded sensors and displays that could shift color or texture to match terrain in real time. There were even metamaterial experiments, scientific tongue twisters that involved manipulating electromagnetic waves to redirect light entirely around an object. The problem? Physics and power and cost. You need absurd amounts of energy, perfect environmental conditions and materials that don't yet exist outside of the Star Trek prop department. Most of the real-world versions amounted to sophisticated cloaks of partial invisibility, able to fool cameras or observers under ideal conditions, but far from Hollywood's disappearing act. Still, the military continues to invest in this dream, because the fantasy of being able to walk through a battlefield unseen, unchallenged, and untouchable is too powerful to abandon. It's not about magic. It's about control. And war is, after all, the art of vanishing your vulnerability before the other guy does. Coming next, Semper Paratus, sky surfing radar, and soldiers who sniff out threats, with 6 legs and wings. The U.S. Marine Corps has a tradition of esprit de corps. Some branches have loyalty, others have duty. The Marines, they have esprit de corps. And while the phrase is French, what it means in practice is distinctly American. An unbreakable, almost irrational sense of pride, unity, and identity. So intense that it can feel like a spiritual possession. Esprit de corps isn't just a mood, it's a mindset. A cult with bayonets. From the moment a recruit steps onto the yellow footprints at boot camp, they're not just being trained, they're being absorbed. Into a lineage, into a mythos, into a metaphysical brotherhood that prides itself not just on winning wars, but on how they carry themselves through them. It's the reason Marines will correct you on the street if you call them a soldier. It's why they still say "rah" without irony, decades after retirement. And it's why they'll fight each other over which Marine division has the best chow hall. This tradition is reinforced through every ritual. The grueling physical expectations, the uniforms worn with laser precision, the uncompromising drill instructors who demand perfection not because it's practical, but because it creates identity. Esprit de corps is built out of shared hardship and carefully nurtured ego. And in battle, it's not just about morale, it's a weapon. When every Marine believes they are the tip of the spear, they often perform like it. It's the thing that makes a Marine volunteer for the mission no one wants, or stay calm when the radio's gone dead and the sky's on fire. Esprit de corps is the secret sauce of the Corps. You can't bottle it, replicate it, or fake it, but you can absolutely smell it, from the parade deck to the battlefield. Meanwhile, while the Marines were perfecting psychological cohesion, the Army was busy building battlefield silence. Not emotional silence, literal acoustic silence. The U.S. military once considered using acoustic camouflage to make vehicles quieter. In the never-ending race between detection and deception, sound has always been the most neglected giveaway. You can paint a tank to blend into a forest. You can mask radar signatures with carbon fiber. But if your vehicle sounds like a metal Godzilla wheezing through a hangover, stealth goes right out the exhaust pipe. That's where acoustic camouflage comes in. The U.S. military has long dabbled in technologies meant to reduce, mask, or manipulate the sound signatures of its vehicles. This includes tanks, helicopters, and even mobile artillery. The goal? To make them sound like something else, or nothing at all. A 70-ton Abrams rumbling like a Prius. A chopper that purrs instead of roars. Early attempts were charmingly crude. Mufflers, baffles, sound-deadening panels. But as warfare got smarter, so did the attempts at silence. Engineers began exploring active sound cancellation. Essentially, machines that emit inverse sound waves to cancel out engine noise. Think of it like noise-canceling headphones, but for a death machine. Even more ambitious proposals use directional audio technology to redirect sound upward or away from enemy positions. Others experimented with coating materials designed to absorb rather than reflect noise, dampening everything from treads to turbines. Naturally, this kind of innovation wasn't just for stealth ops. Acoustic masking would also help prevent detection from drones, satellites with audio monitoring systems, or old-fashioned ears on the ground. It's the difference between getting the drop on the enemy or being the one dropped by the enemy. But the dream of the silent battlefield vehicle always danced one step ahead of reality. Acoustic camouflage remains an elusive goal, impressive in controlled environments, but fickle in the mud, chaos, and unpredictability of war. Still, the effort persists. Because in battle, silence isn't just golden, it's lethal. And while the Army tried to quiet the machines, the Coast Guard just kept listening. Over hundreds of miles of open ocean for one sound in particular. The faint crackle of a distress signal, far beyond America's borders. The U.S. Coast Guard has a search and rescue mission that extends far beyond U.S. waters. If you think the Coast Guard's jurisdiction ends at the beach, think again. Their search and rescue mission isn't just national, it's global, and it's dead serious. Whether it's a capsized fishing boat in Alaskan waters or a cargo ship aflame halfway across the Pacific, the U.S. Coast Guard is the one getting the call, and usually the first to answer it. This is not some polite patrol along sunny coastlines. It's a 24/7, no-excuses rescue net that stretches across tens of millions of square miles of ocean. The Coast Guard is responsible for safeguarding lives far beyond U.S. territorial waters. In fact, their designated Search and Rescue Region, SRR, encompasses large chunks of the Arctic, Atlantic, Pacific, and Gulf of Mexico. In some sectors, no other country even bothers. They just assume the Americans will handle it. And most of the time, they do. Missions range from the simple to the cinematic. Downed aircraft, sinking cruise liners, medical evacuations from oil rigs, or rogue distress beacons going off in the middle of nowhere. Coast Guard crews, pilots, swimmers, cutters, are trained to operate in all conditions, from hurricanes to hostile territory. If you're on the verge of drowning in some forgotten corner of the ocean, odds are it's a coastie hoisting you up. It's a job with no glory, no headlines, and no guaranteed backup. But it embodies the service's core ethos, semper paratus, always ready, even when it's not their problem, even when no one's watching. Coming next, heliographs, weather weapons, and dog tags that once came in paper form. Because the past wasn't just weirder, it was flammable. The U.S. Army once used heliographs to signal with mirrors. Before digital encryption, before satellites and fiber optics, the U.S. Army once harnessed one of the most ancient technologies known to mankind, sunlight. Specifically, redirected sunlight. Enter the heliograph, a signaling device that used mirrors and flashes of reflected light to transmit Morse code across long distances. Part battlefield tech, part Boy Scout science project. These devices weren't just for novelty. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly in dry, open terrains like the American Southwest or deserts abroad, heliographs were crucial. The Army found them particularly useful during campaigns against Native American tribes, in places where telegraph lines couldn't reach and riders were too slow. A good operator could flash messages up to 50 miles on a clear day, using a system so simple it was almost genius. Tilt the mirror, catch the sun, blink your message. No batteries, no wires, no fuel. Just the sky and a shiny object. Tactical sunbathing. But the downside, weather. Clouds made it a glorified paperweight. And at night, well, forget it. Still, heliographs saw action well into the early 20th century before being phased out by radio and field telephones. Yet in their time, they embodied a kind of clever minimalism. When the Army needed to talk, they just lit up the hills. Now, from reflecting sunlight, we go to bending weather itself. Because the Air Force once thought the sky should be just another weaponized tool. The U.S. Air Force once had a program to develop weather weapons. If you're starting to suspect that the military's favorite hobby is trying to control nature, you'd be right. After dabbling in rainmaking during Vietnam, the U.S. Air Force took things a step further. What if you didn't just modify the weather, but used it as a weapon? Cue an era of bizarre, ambitious proposals involving storm seeding, lightning direction, and cloud manipulation. The dream was to create a strategic advantage, bog down enemies in mud by triggering monsoons, shroud operations in fog, or fry radar stations during engineered thunderstorms. Essentially, battlefield sabotage by way of Mother Nature's mood swings. Some plans were merely theoretical. Others reached small-scale field tests. Scientists toyed with launching chemicals into the atmosphere to induce cloud formation or break it apart. There were also proposals for ionospheric manipulation, essentially using high-frequency waves to tweak the Earth's upper atmosphere, redirect weather patterns, or even disrupt communication. The problem? Weather is chaos with a caffeine addiction. Predicting it is hard. Controlling it? Nearly impossible. By the late 1970s, the ethical, environmental, and diplomatic pushback grew, especially with fears of global backlash. The U.S. eventually signed international agreements to prohibit weather warfare. But don't be fooled. Somewhere in a quiet lab, someone's still wondering, what if we could control the next hurricane? While that plays out in secret, we end with a more grounded mystery, one you wear around your neck. The U.S. military once used dog tags for identification, originally made of paper. It's hard to imagine now, but there was a time when U.S. soldiers entered battle wearing identification tags made out of paper. Before today's metal dog tags became standard, early methods of identifying fallen troops were wildly inconsistent and sometimes tragically useless. During the Civil War, soldiers often made their own tags, scribbling names on scraps of paper, etching initials onto coins, or wearing makeshift ID discs carved from wood. There was no official issue. The War Department hadn't caught up to the idea that identifying the dead might matter after the cannon smoke cleared. Some units tried distributing paper tags or cardboard cards inside uniform pockets. Others relied on nothing but prayer and Sharpie-style ingenuity. But in muddy trenches or burning battlefields, paper didn't last long. The result? Tens of thousands of unidentifiable casualties. It wasn't until 1906 that the Army formally issued aluminum identification tags. By World War I, 2 tags were standard, one to stay with the body, one to send back for record keeping. The iconic clink of dog tags became a symbol of identity, sacrifice, and bureaucracy, finally catching up to common sense. Today, they're digital, scanned, and stored in the cloud. But it all started with a strip of paper and a hope that someone, somewhere, would remember your name. Up next, the Navy's floating libraries, walking tanks, and a whole zoo of animal messengers, including cats who, almost, became spies. The U.S. Navy once had a ship's library for sailors to read. In between torpedo drills, battle stations, and soul-eroding boredom, sailors had one escape that didn't involve cards, cigarettes, or questionable tattoos: the ship's library. Yes, that's right. The U.S. Navy, in all its rigid hierarchy and steel-plated seriousness, once made room on its warships for books. Thousands of them. You wouldn't expect it. Space is tight on a destroyer, and priority typically goes to things like food, fuel, and anti-aircraft guns. But knowledge, it turns out, was also considered essential gear. Starting in the early 20th century, and especially during World War II, most Navy vessels included a designated reading area stocked with fiction, nonfiction, technical manuals, and even poetry. The logic was straightforward. Bored sailors get distracted. Distracted sailors make mistakes. Reading keeps minds sharp and mutinies at bay. Books ranged from seafaring adventure tales to dense treatises on philosophy. Moby Dick, obviously. Shakespeare, oddly common. Military histories, everywhere. There were even rotating libraries, collections sent from shore bases that traveled from ship to ship. And if your ship didn't have space for a dedicated room, well, a footlocker with paperbacks would do. The Navy knew that reading offered something critical to morale: escape. When you're stuck in the middle of the Pacific on a tin can of steel with 300 other men and no privacy, a book is the only way to go anywhere else. Today, these physical libraries have largely been replaced by digital archives and e-readers. But the ghost of the ship's library lives on, in quiet corners of berthing spaces, where someone's still trying to finish For Whom the Bell Tolls before the next watch. Meanwhile, back on land, the Army was trying to bring the machines to life. Literally. The U.S. Army once attempted to create walking tanks. The tank, symbol of brute force, armored defiance, and mechanical intimidation. But what if it didn't just roll into battle? What if it walked? Yes, the U.S. Army, with its long-standing love affair with bizarre prototypes, once toyed with the idea of walking tanks, giant bipedal, or sometimes quadrupedal, armored vehicles that could traverse terrain wheels and treads couldn't handle. Mountains, forests, urban rubble, no problem. Just let your tank put one foot in front of the other. The early concepts weren't quite Iron Man or AT-ATs, but they weren't far off in ambition. Experimental models resembled robotic spiders or skeletal elephants, often fueled by internal combustion and directed by hydraulic limbs. Some designs even included gyroscopes to keep the beast upright, a laughably optimistic assumption given how difficult it is to keep a two-legged robot from falling over on a flat floor. Still, the military was intrigued. A walking tank could theoretically climb stairs, step over trenches, and pivot on a dime. It could go where wheels sank and where tracks jammed. But in practice, they were noisy, slow, and broke constantly. Every field test ended with engineers scratching their heads while some expensive limb flailed in the mud like a dying mechanical insect. Eventually, the idea was shelved, though echoes of it still surface in exosuit prototypes and robotic mules. But it all started with the unkillable military fantasy. Give the machine legs, and it will win the war. And while tanks were learning how to walk, animals were doing something even more unbelievable. They were carrying messages, sometimes with wings, sometimes with fur, sometimes with, well, cats. The U.S. military once considered using animal messengers, like carrier pigeons, but also dogs and even cats. Long before encrypted emails and satellite phones, the U.S. military relied on one of nature's most unpredictable delivery services: animals. Not just in wartime folklore, this was an official strategy. The military actually deployed pigeons, dogs, and yes, even cats to transport messages, detect threats, and occasionally commit low-key espionage. Carrier pigeons were the most successful. Trained to fly back to their home coops, they carried tiny tubes containing critical battlefield messages. Some pigeons were credited with saving entire units by flying through gunfire to deliver coordinates or call for reinforcements. These weren't just birds, they were tiny feathered veterans. Some even received medals. Seriously, dogs too had a role. Beyond their use as scouts or guards, some were trained to deliver messages across trenches, through minefields, and even in urban combat zones. Loyal, fast, and capable of sneaking through areas a human couldn't. These canine couriers had a decent track record, even if they occasionally stopped for snacks or got distracted by a passing squirrel. And cats? Oh, the military tried. Some intelligence units explored the use of cats outfitted with microphones and tracking gear. The plan was to release them into high-security areas, let them snoop around unnoticed, and retrieve the surveillance data later. It mostly failed, because cats, unsurprisingly, did whatever they wanted. One infamous test cat ran into traffic during its first mission. So much for stealth. Still, the idea of animal messengers highlights something critical. When the stakes are high and the tech is unreliable, sometimes the weirdest solution is the best one. Or at least, the most memorable.